how is it using cold email, you can generate leads on a consistent basis? So if you have been exposed to a lot of the comments as related to cold email, you'll hear people say cold email doesn't work, cold email spammy, cold email's dead in 2026, 2027, cold email this, cold email that, whatever it might be. But of course, much like a lot of other mediums, from a outbound perspective, cold email still exists. Everyone's still using email. No one has gone away from email. If you're thinking about the most used medium when it comes to business communication in the world, it is email. Ultimately, it's where people refer to when they want to look for historical, single, or ultimate source of truth, if you will, i.e., what happened with XYZ project or campaign or otherwise in a ultimately legal environment. People will refer back to historical email. And that's because email is still the foundational medium when it comes to business dialogue. And therefore, unless that changes, email will not die. And therefore, it presents a massive opportunity when it comes to marketing. One of the big premises of how to conduct any type of new business activity is people will say, okay, let's go where the conversation is. And people will therefore say, right, let's go to social media. Let's use LinkedIn, or let's use TikTok, or whatever the latest platform might be. But of course, if you think or look at it from a pure play usage perspective, any business, when they go into business, the first thing they're going to do is register an email address, even if they're using a Gmail or a Hotmail. So therefore, in terms of total addressable market, when people think about any type of communication, email still supersedes, I would venture, any other medium when it comes to business. So I think that that's often forgotten in that dialogue and that narrative. And that's why I'm excited to talk to you about what I've learned when it comes to cold email, how we at Pearl Lemon think about cold email, and therefore how you can get a sense from some of the things that we'll discuss today, how to effectively operate cold email, whether you're doing it as an individual, whether you're a freelancer, whether you're doing it as part of an agency and you've got clients, or whether you're a enterprise SME, SMB, and you're looking to run outbound campaigns yourself, and or you're not quite seeing the success that you'd hope from cold emails that you run. So today we're going to be broadly covering like 4 buckets, I would say. So we're going to be looking at cold email infrastructure. We're going to be looking at ultimately cold email, the ICP, if you will, how to develop, your ideal customer profile. We'll be looking at then how that relates to list building, and then we'll be looking at cold email copy. So they're the 4 segments, if you will, that we're going to be covering today and going through in a certain amount of detail. So I think that what's interesting when you think about those areas is that as a basic premise, a lot of people don't think deeply enough about each of those areas and think about how they are contingent, meaning that you can have successful cold email infrastructure, but if you write poor email copy, you can still get 0 results. You can write great email copy, but if it's not delivering into anyone's inbox, you can get 0 results. You can have great infrastructure, great email copy, but then if you're not addressing it to the right avatar, you can still get poor results. So that's where I talk about this concept of contingency, that you need to have your ducks in order when it comes to each of these buckets as related to cold email. And if you don't treat them with equal care, you'll often find that you're going to not see the success you're hoping for. Certainly if you're doing it at scale, because when you're doing it at scale, i.e., we'll come to, of course, talk about this, i.e., you're not using your own domain because you're going to be looking at it as a dedicated outbound process, then all of these factors come into play. So the rules to a degree are fungible or flexible depending upon the nature of the activity that you're going to look at. So when there's companies that are looking to send no more than 20 to 50 emails a day, in those instances, at times, some of the rules can change depending upon your preference. So then maybe there's a use case to look at doing it from your own domain, etc. But we'll kind of come to that in more detail as we start talking about the cold email infrastructural side. Now, what's interesting is that Deepak Shukla, founder at Pearl Lemon, we've been using cold email as a platform internally. So we've been in business. If you were to look us up, we incorporated in 2016. Then we were per traffic. And for our first 2 years, I think we began using email in year 2 as a platform to generate new clients for ourselves. And I think maybe we did anything from 50 to £100,000 in new business ultimately from cold email. Now, what's interesting if I go back and look at what I was doing then back in 2017, without knowing it, then I was doing some of the things they talk about today as being the fundamentals of how to produce effective cold email. And what's interesting is that as, let's call it, the technology changes or the tools change, I can see now that I've been active in the space for 8 to 10 years that some of the fundamental principles actually haven't changed in terms of what I was doing then, in terms of the thinking behind it, still absolutely applies today. And that's the interesting part. So the goal for today is to talk to you about timeless strategies that won't change irrespective of ultimately the changes that may come when it comes to technology, or people are talking, of course, now about AI agents and otherwise, and what you can do with Claude and the like. But today we're going to be talking about the fundamentals that, if all things continuously change, what is it that will still remain the same in 5 years from now, in 10 years from now? And that's where they talk about, and this is one of the things I think that becomes really important with the development of any type of strategy, that it's useful to have in your mind's eye this concept of what are strategies that remain timeless, and what are things in the world of whirlwind change when it comes to, for example, AI, and I can do this with an outbound agent. What is it that still fundamentally is the core premise when it comes to running messages from an outbound perspective? And we'll be talking about, what those mechanics actually are today. But with that in mind, what we will begin to go through is looking at some of the tenets of ultimately cold email infrastructure, and why some of these things are important. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and walk you through some of the elements as related to, as we discussed, cold email infrastructure. And I'm going to kind of whiz through these, but use this as a mechanism to offer you the relevant insight as related to cold email. So I'm just using Lemtask, which is a to-do list manager platform that we have here. So yeah, for the benefit of the audience, I'm going to go through these relatively quickly and or pause when I think that some things require further explanation. Okay. Now, feel free to ask questions, but put your hand up, use the reaction button here on Riverside, or just put your hand up if you've got a question or a comment that you want to make. So yeah, let's just go through these elements in general. So first of all, of course, you've got separate sending infrastructure from your main domain. If you're new to cold email, then you may not be aware that having separate lookalike domains is really important rather than your root domain. The premise around that, of course, is that if you run cold email from your main domain, there is a chance that becomes more probable if you're doing it at scale that you can end up affecting the reputation of your actual main domain, i.e. it influences deliverability, and that relates to sending patterns as well as ultimately how sending patterns fundamentally. If you're doing it from your own domain, your domain's typically trusted. If you are a business that's been around for several years, if you're a new business, it's probably even worse to do it from your main domain because your domain isn't trusted. So then as soon as you start sending out cold email campaigns from your main domain, it's going to very much likely end up in spam. So I would also say that whilst there is perhaps some opportunity to use subdomains, I would still not use anything that's attached to your TLD, which is your top level domain. So in that instance, if it's pearllemon.com, you could use, getpearllemon.com. That's quite common. Or as you see here, it says, pearllemon-mail.com. It talks about using subdomains. I would tend to stay away from using subdomains, but yeah, separate lookalike domains for outbound rather than the main root domain to prevent deliverability issues. So then there's ultimately technical elements that relate to this. So people talk about, for those of you who are not familiar, you've got several. You've got SPF, which is, I think, sender policy framework. Your DKIM, which is domain key. I forget the IM specifically. And you've got DMARC records, and there's actually more. So the good way to think about the technical side of domains is it all relates to security, trust, and policies. So ultimately, what a good way to think about it is, if you, and this is the way that I like to think about it, is that if you are, for example, the owner of the BBC, right, and you have a building, then you might contract the UPS, which is a postal service, right, to deliver your post from your building, BBC, over to Forbes. building that's 4 streets down the road. Now, what you want to do when you do that is that what Forbes needs to ensure that this package, well, first of all, Forbes want to ensure that is this package that's been delivered by UPS really coming from the BBC, or is it someone who's impersonating the BBC? Okay. And also, if this package is really coming from the BBC, has it been authorized and approved by the BBC? And then also, this UPS guy who's coming, is this UPS guy ultimately impersonating the UPS, or is he really the UPS? Okay. So if you're new to about some of these frameworks, it's ultimately ESP's, email sending platform's way of determining the validity and the trust and the security of ultimately any messages being delivered. And when you don't have proper technical structure set up, what tends to happen then is that there's going to be issues that relate to trust. And that's where the world of ultimately spam comes into play. So that's then when we look at this, of course, SPFs tell receiving systems that are allowed to send mail for your domain. So that's a case of saying, okay, great. The UPS are officially allowed to send posts on our behalf because we've got a contract with the UPS. Okay. And that's when, if you're sending from a Google Workspace account to another account, they'll say, well, have you got a valid Google Workspace account, and do you actually own this domain? And that's where you're able to, modify the actual elements of the domain or the mailbox. And that's where the SPF comes into play. So this is some of the elements that relate to that. And as it says here, broken SPF record is one of the fastest ways to ruin deliverability. So making sure that you've got the SPF set up is quite important. And then you've got, of course, the DKIM, which is a cryptographic signature to make sure that the message en route from the BBC to Forbes wasn't altered along the way or swapped out along the way. Okay. So one of the things, if you think about it from a security perspective, if the UPS is sending, I've got a valuable post, I've got a watch, a £10,000 watch. Let's say this isn't a £10,000 watch. It's a Garmin. But let's just say this is a £10,000 watch. I'm sending it from jewelers or the BBC anyway, for whatever reason, as a private package, but via the BBC to Sorab, who's in the Forbes building. We need to make sure that no one has swapped out the watch along the way. Okay. And that's where you need DKIM configuration. And again, there's elements to this. So what tends to often happen in the technical space or the non-technical space is that people set these things up, but they don't really understand why they're setting them up. So then sometimes some of these things get skipped. Okay. So what's useful as you begin to build a mental model is understanding why these things are set up and what they're actually for. And once you understand the purpose of them, you'll then begin to appreciate that you shouldn't skip these and they should really be done. And what's also interesting, for those of you on the agency side, if you're watching, these still need to be set up for a company's parent domain as well. So a quick thing that you could do to, for example, add value is not whilst you're only looking at your DKIM, DMARC, SPF, DNS, and there's going to be more. Look at it for your actual client's main inbox as well. Since you're running these checks, if you're in the agency side, and I say this to those of you who are agency owners, me running an agency, it seems very pertinent to check on your client's behalf to say, well, you know what, in fact, you've got a couple of issues that are affecting your deliverability, because what often happens is that clients also, if you think about it, everyone also, to be honest with you, it's not just clients, also sends some level of cold email from their own actual domain when they're messaging people for the first time, or when they're engaging with a new email address for the first time, whether you're sending it to someone that you met at a networking event, whether you're sending it because you want to run some of your old cold email. So it does make sense to also check on your client's behalf to say, whilst we were running our own checks, we ran a check on your own domain, and here's a series of recommendations for your own team. Why don't you execute these technical changes? So there's a little bit of value that you can provide by just running these checks in parallel for every single client you have. Or if you're a business owner, for every single domain that you've got as well. So don't just look at this for cold email, look at it for your internal accounts, okay? And ultimately, then we've got if you think about the Forbes, and that principle is the DMARC records, which is, I forget the acronyms for them. However, what's important to think about this is about ultimately the handling of the actual package itself. So as you can see here, how to handle emails that fail authentication require alignment between the visible from address and SPF and DKIM. Ultimately, this is what happens with domain or message handling, and making sure that you've got a DMARC record. the way that I liken it is a little bit like thinking about, well, if this email is spam, what do we do with it? And do you have proper policies in place? So people talk about, for example, GDPR. This is a good way of thinking about it from a policy perspective. Okay, so as we continue down the list, you'll see the DNS hygiene. There's also a correct PTR record that's a useful signal. So the standards in terms of the basics are SPF, DKIM, DMARC, but also there's other elements also that begin to become useful. So Microsoft themselves note that a correct PTR record is useful. So what you will find, and this is a useful mental model that I keep, is that the technical requirements will always be, to a degree, a moving target, meaning that there's going to be new policies, new frameworks, new governing bodies that come out. When I was an accountant at Deloitte, as an example, I worked in the tax consulting department, and half of what we were paid for was, can you help us keep up to date with the latest policies? Because the policies are always changing from a taxation perspective. So therefore, let us know what we need to do from a reporting or governance perspective to ensure that we are compliant with the regulations. So cold email has its own, or Google and Microsoft have their own regulatory body. So your goal in the world of cold email is to just make sure that you are, and I'll come back to the screen in a minute, but a good way to think about it is, are you compliant? So there'll be lots of acronyms that change over time. So as an example, PTR wasn't an acronym when I started 10 years ago. As an example, like looking at, for example, reverse DNS wasn't something that I would specifically consider 10 years ago. But the important part here is keeping the mental model in mind that we just need to be compliant. And it's useful if you're in the world of cold email, or you're going to be doing cold emails, looking at what is the latest compliant according to the governing bodies and what is everything. And it's always better to have everything that's compliant, even when people say, oh, you don't really need that, than to do 4/5 of it. So comprehensive compliance from a cold email infrastructure perspective is just a sensible way to ultimately think about how to set up and structure your cold email campaigns. And whenever you're watching this video, whether it's at the time of recording, if you're here with us live, or if it's even 2 years from now, the whole principle is timeless tactics. So it's useful to keep in mind that that's what's the most important thing that will keep you compliant and correct and effective when it comes to cold emails. Just keeping that principle in mind, because that was true when I was at Deloitte back in 2009. It's 2026 at the time of recording, and it's still going to be true today, because I've got friends that work in ultimately accounting or accounting in different companies, and they say, yeah, the budget comes out every year, or the tax legislation gets updated every year, and half of what we're paid for is to make sure that the companies that contract with us on a consulting perspective are remaining compliant with the fast changing rules. So that's the goal of anyone who's conducting cold email. The good thing is that there aren't sweeping changes that happen every single year, but probably there are lots of little ones, and it's worth keeping abreast of what all of those little ones are. Okay, so with that in mind, as we kind of continue down the thread and we think about, well, what is it that also becomes important from continuing the compliance perspective, with that mental model in mind, I'll kind of skip through some of these headlines, because the thinking behind it is the part that's important. So DKIM, confirming messages are actually signed. We discussed that. Publishing a DMARC record, ensuring the DNS is clean. So that's valid MX, correct A record, forward DNS present. You've got all of these elements. And then we continue right down the road, which is use professional inboxes, not cheap random SMTP hacks. So the thing to think about this is that there'll be people that, for example, will suggest, look, I want to set. So this number 6 seems, so in some respects, perhaps obvious, but what's not obvious, especially for those of you who are in the cold email or agency space, is you'll get companies that want to send out 100,000 emails a month, 1 million emails a month. And there is a world of providers that set up and present alternative SMTPs that they can use to get millions of emails going out, or hundreds of thousands of emails going out. I can tell you from anecdotal personal experience here at Pearl Lemon that Saurabh, who's here with me today, he'll be testament to it. And there's been stuff before, even Saurabh's been with us maybe 4 years now, I think maybe 3-4 years, And even in the era before Sarab was around, we have tried using, maybe now last count from memory, maybe 15 different types of SMTPs over the years. They've never really been that effective because the world fundamentally trusts Google and Microsoft when it comes to cold email. And the reason that that's important to keep as a mental model is that it's pertinent when you are sending cold messages or going into any room or any environment to use respected and trusted platforms. Okay. In the same way that on our SEO side, when we walk into a room, people expect us to use Ahrefs or SEMrush because they are kind of the Rolex or the Cartier or even the Casio or the Garmin, whatever. They are recognized name brands within the actual SEO space. Now, in the cold email space, Google and Microsoft have something of a monopoly, I would argue, and therefore it's always more challenging when you use alternative providers. So these are things just to think about. And then there's, you know, things that relate ultimately per sending identity, and there'll be what's really interesting when it comes to sending identity, as well as how many mailboxes per domain, as an example that you set up. The thing to really think about is all of this, the subtext of how many inboxes should I use? What should the frequency be? You know, and you'll hear this from different providers, and there's different kind of theses from different providers. The providers of today, you know, there's Mailshake, there's Lemlist, there's Reach Inbox. These names may be totally different at the time of recording, but the mental model to keep in mind with all of this is that you need congruency, consistency, and non-spamminess. So when we talk about congruency, what does that mean? One of the things that people often get wrong that we've seen that makes sense is that when you set up, for example, a Google Workspace, do you have the display name configured within the Google Workspace so it has your actual display name? Do you also then have an image attached to the display name so that when people receive cold emails, there's an image potentially attached to it, and there's a first name, last name attached to it? And then when that person looks at when the recipient receives that, is there a real world avatar attached to that person? So if you're doing omnichannel or multi-channel lead generation, you're doing email, we're not covering LinkedIn today, but if you're doing email and LinkedIn, then if you're sending cold email campaigns, does a cold email campaign line up with an actual identity for someone on LinkedIn? So what you want to do is that you want to make sure that you keep ultimately everything congruent, and it goes all the way down to consistent identity, consistent footprint online, consistent platforms online, and scaled and structured sending, and starting flow, you know, start slow, finish fast, start slow, finish fast kind of principle, or start slow or scale slow. And that's where some of this stuff really relates to. So the professional inbox, no cheap random SMTP hacks, custom tracking. If you do use custom tracking, the thing, so for those of you who are not familiar with what a custom tracking domain is the way to think about it is that you want to know if someone has opened or read your email. And obviously, the only way to do that, if you think about it being kind of a carrier pigeon, right? So before there were telephones and before there was communication, in some parts of the world, they would use pigeons to send messages, certainly to ships that were out at sea or close to land, they would send pigeons, right? And those pigeons would carry messages. And the only way to fundamentally track if the pigeon has arrived is that, of course, the pigeon has a message that it leaves. So similarly, how can we know if a message has been received and opened? Well, you have to have a little pixel, which is another word for a tracking tag, but it's a tracking tag that arrives in a person's inbox. Now, when a domain sees it, so when a recipient knows that they're being tracked, this email was tracked, this email was opened, and you can imagine there's a lot of technology to detect if an email is being tracked. It can impact deliverability, because when people are being tracked, then people feel that, well, should I trust you? So again, it's useful when you think about all of these things about the real world application, because all of it is quite logical. And then what happens is sometimes people get lost. So what you can have from providers such as let's take Reach Inbox or Mailshake, is that they have shared tracking domains. So they'll give you domains, I believe, as part of their actual setup. But it's always better to not use ultimately those domains and to set up something that's custom with, for example, your own domain, and or to use Google Workspace or Microsoft. A lot of people now will advocate the less tracking, the better, just rely upon replies. There's different theses around this, but the thing to keep in mind is that custom tracking is better if you do actually use tracking. So let's keep going, because some of this stuff I think becomes more obvious if you're thinking about cold email. One-click unsubscribe are a very clear unsubscribe path, because, and the interesting thing to think about there is that people often miss this, basically. What I mean by that is that you ultimately need to make sure that you have a clean opt-out mechanism, as it says here, to lower compliance risk. And just make sure that when you're sending cold emails that you have a unsubscribe. And what you can do, for those of you, because I know that the audience today are in an agency space, it's also worth checking if internally the companies you're working with are sending any level of cold email, because sometimes they have sales reps who are sending out cold emails all of the time, and it's worth, even in those emails, to add a little unsubscribe if they're using any level of automation. So what you can do is figure out, are you guys out of interest sending cold emails internally? Are you using your main domain? And are you adding unsubscribe links? So it's sometimes worth just checking if they're doing it internally. So as we continue, balance handling and suppression list. Ultimately, most platforms will do this for you. So any provider that you use should ultimately tell you unsubscribes, opts out, do not contact addresses, but it's worth just investigating with your platform, how is this stuff managed, just to ensure from a compliance perspective that they're catching hard bounces, invalid recipients, spam, unsubscribes, opt-outs, and making sure that they're never emailed again. As we continue, the next element is warm up inboxes and ramping volume. So look, I think that again, the what's important with warm ups is it's obeying the common sense rule of, as it says here, don't send 5 emails one day and send 200 the next. Don't try and skip warming up, because it can be very problematic if you do skip it. I would say that the volume part makes sense, low daily volume, building gradually, and then looking at it in that way. And it's about, as it says, volume consistency. The other thing that I think that it's useful to think about then also is that if all of the warm-up, because there'll be different warm-up providers that you do get, and if all of the warm-ups are happening on personal Gmails, which is what you'll often see, then suddenly all of the outreach is corporate emails. That's also a very obvious pattern. The whole principle of warm-up inboxes is to simulate or replicate normal inbox behavior. What not all warm-up providers do, though, is have a rotating list of corporate email domains that they're actually using. So that's just something to keep in mind when it comes to warm-ups. Like, are they all just personal Gmails and Hotmails? And then suddenly, are we sending out lots of corporate emails? For me, this is something at the time of recording that not a lot of the providers actually do, because it's costly to maintain corporate accounts. But it's worth investigating where you can do that, to say, look, do you do anything with corporate emails? Because I do think that, and what you'll often find here, guys, is everyone's got a kind of different opinion. But if you understand that common sense applies when you actually run these campaigns, you'll begin to see that it's a common sense that informs how these things actually work, okay? Because there's always logic behind it. So warming up is a big part of these things, okay? So then just continuing down that line, what's useful to understand is that you can have mailbox reputation and then domain reputation, and then you can have multiple mailboxes attached to one domain. So it's useful to just understand the mental model behind this, because what that means is, if you have a domain, let's just continue with the BBC example. I am determined to get this watch that Saurabh's been chasing me about, or Saurabh's not been chasing me about, because I want to really work with Saurabh and I want to get him sent this watch. Saurabh's over at the BBC building, the Forbes building. I'm in the BBC building. I want to get this package via UPS sent to Saurabh, and I have my domain, which is getwatches@bbc.com, and I'm sending the watch to Saurabh because it's a new product that the BBC are launching, and they're not aware, and they want to target Saurabh. That I have a reputation as related to my domain, right? Which is getwatches@bbc.com. Getwatches@bbc. That's my domain, okay? And that domain carries a reputation. Now, I might not be the only person who's determined to get this watch over to Saurabh. Maybe there's 3 of us. Maybe there's Surab, maybe there's Saima, and there's maybe Sabomi. And we're the team, we're the hit squad. So then all of a sudden we've got Deepak at getwatches@bbc.com, Saima at getwatches@bbc.com, and then Sabomi. So now we have mailboxes, right? So we have 1 domain and we have 3 mailboxes. And therefore, in total, how many total assets do we have? Anyone? How many total assets do we have? No one? Yeah, go ahead, Zora.
Yeah, so we have a domain. So at the top level, we have a domain, and then we have 3 mailboxes connected to it, which are the 3 people who have their email accounts created on that domain. So in total, the assets would be 4, the domain plus the 3 email accounts.
Perfect. Great. Exactly. So we've got 4 assets that we need to monitor when it comes from a reputation standpoint. Okay, guys. And the thing to think about that people don't often think about it is how many strands or how many assets do we need to protect reputationally? And therefore, do you have a mechanism to check the individual reputation of all of these items? Now, one reputation, which is the domain, can impact the reputation of all of the individual mailboxes. But then also, you might have one mailbox that has a shitty list that's put into it that then stops working whilst the other actual mailboxes work. So what often gets lost is that, do we have a mechanism to check the reputation of each of the individual assets? Or are we looking at it singularly globally? Because we then might think this asset, the domain, has stopped working, when in fact, it's a reputation as related to the mailbox. So think about all elements of your sending campaigns. And once you understand all of the assets that you have access to, then you need to have a procedure to run testing in some kind of automated way to check is it a mailbox problem? Is it a individual mailbox problem, or is it a domain level problem? So these are things to kind of think about when you think about mailboxes and asset management across your infrastructure. So that's something that isn't carefully thought about enough. Okay. And that's where, these things are fairly self-explanatory. Multiple mailboxes, distribute volume, mailbox volume conservative, avoid large bars, stagger send times. So staggering send times to make it look like it's human. Human doesn't send the same email at 4 p.m. every day. A human doesn't send, for example, a email at 4 p.m., 6 p.m., 7 p.m., 8 p.m. It's sporadic, and a person might send 10 emails in the morning, 3 in the afternoon, and then 1 at the end of the day. So when you look at ultimately the configuration of platforms, think about it in those terms. Do they have a ability to send it as an actual human would send it? Because humans don't send it every hour on the hour as well. And that's often something that most platforms will typically provide. But actually, that doesn't reflect human behavior, because humans aren't really using email in that way. It's a bit more kind of random than that. So yeah, that's just something to kind of consider when you think about it. Now, this part is really quite interesting for me. Configure reply handling properly. So it says here, a surprising number of cold email systems are technically broken. So what does this mean? And I'll talk about in practice what we've seen at Pearl Lemon. At Pearl Lemon, I think we have seen companies that singularly rely upon the cold email platform provider to check if leads are coming in. So what that means is that if you're, for example, using Mailshake or Reach Inbox, you're not going to source, because actually, if you think about it, if you set up a cold email campaign using Google Workspace, then you are only checking whether leads are coming in using your reporting provider. So that's the equivalent in SEO of saying, I'm going to check my traffic in Ahrefs, but I'm not going to check the primary source, which is Google Search Console. So you need to, when you're thinking about reply handling, is consider actual reply management or reply visibility. So are you checking the actual source? Now, there's platforms that will allow you, I think Mail Meteor was one that we used at Pearl Lemon, but there's going to be platforms that allow you to rotate and look in the actual inboxes, or at some point you need to go in and probably manually check the inboxes, because you need to ensure, because if you think about it, the way that any platform works is they have some kind of programmatic or deterministic logic based on what people say in an email to determine if it's actually a actual lead. So and they'll have very strong logic built in to support that, but it's never foolproof. And I've seen often that there's always a couple of leads that we don't see that exist in inboxes that for whatever reason slip through the needle. So making sure because if you're doing cold email at scale, you'll use a platform such as Instantly is another one, but it's also still worth going directly to the source of the platform. Okay. And then these other things, of course, are just really useful. So is it going to, of course, a monitored inbox? So the reply, can you set a reply to that's a monitored inbox? So when you send cold email campaigns going out, can you set up a reply to that goes somewhere else? Because then it's going to an inbox that's monitored. So that would be a useful one to ultimately think about. No reply addresses avoided. Yep, absolutely. That's just a case of list building. Automatic forwarding or CRM sync if needed. That does, for example, your platform allow you to sync into a CRM. So whether that's a Google Sheet, whether that's HubSpot, whether that's Salesforce, whatever it is, do you have a way to automatically have for example, we use Reach Inbox, but do you then even need to check Reach Inbox immediately? No doubt you'll check everything, but can't it drop into a Google Sheet with all of the information, or HubSpot with all of it preloaded based upon a sync that's set up? So these things become important. And then, of course, positive replies separated from out of office and auto replies. This is kind of self-explanatory, and the idea is to make sure that all replies are being handled and managed properly, fundamentally. So just configuring reply handling. And I will say on this point that there's this concept of speed kills deals, or lack of speed kills deals. One of the biggest problems that I do see is that people look at cold email replies as a reporting requirement, but it's also an opportunity. There's also an opportunity cost if that lead isn't actually replied to within 5 minutes. So what you need to think about is that as leads come in, what is the infrastructure to ensure that automated replies are going out so that a dialogue can be built with the leads? And that's where AI, absent human intervention, does play a part. So one of the things that I see so many companies fall down upon is that they will say, we have a typically 24-hour to 48-hour reply time. So if you're a freelancer doing this by yourselves, then you will be able to monitor your inbox. But even if you are a freelancer, you're probably at your desk 8 hours a day. At best, you're checking it 14, 16 hours a day. Replies can come in unless you're sending UK offices, UK businesses. And even then, I'm a founder. I might reply to a cold email that I get at 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning because someone sent me something. And imagine if I'm the one who's received the cold email. So now, Saurabh, let's flip it. I sent a message out to Saurabh on Friday at 4 p.m. or Monday, 1 p.m. And I'm like, right, I'm Deepak. I'm sending this message about this watch that I want to sell him. I'm checking my emails all of the time. But that has nothing to do with when Saurabh checks his email. Because all of the time is, but you know what? On Saturday morning at 7 a.m., I'm asleep. Or I'm out with walking the dogs, or I'm out with the kids, or I'm out doing whatever. I'm not at my email. The important thing is, Saurabh decides to reply at 7 a.m. on Saturday. Imagine if Saurabh got a reply within 5 minutes on a Saturday morning. I'm much more likely to get progression with Saurabh because maybe he decides to clear out his emails on Saturday from 7 to 8:30 a.m. He's got a block that he replies. So and this is where I see a lot of people maybe fail once you've got through to the reply thread. What infrastructure do you have to make sure that replies go out? That it's automated, that we have built a process, or you have built a process. Every email gets replied to within 5 minutes, irrespective of the email. So that's where technology does become the assist. And I would advocate that humans are always going to fail when it comes to the quick replies. And even where people say that replies can afford to wait, they can't really. So that's something that's quite important when it comes to reply handling and making sure that you've got infrastructure built to support the cold email replies. So then we've got, of course, before you send out campaigns, authentication and inbox placement. So really it's just a case of testing the things that you built out. So the SPF, the DKIM, the DMARC, there's platforms that will show you, is it configured correctly? I would always advocate, by the way, check up to 3 different platforms to get proper benchmarking. So what sometimes happens is that we use one vendor to check if something is authenticated, okay? But it's important to check multiple vendors. So in the same way when we come to list building, I never advocate just checking email validity through one ultimately tool for checking how many emails are valid. Check from 2, check from 3. The same rules apply here. So if you're doing SPF, DKIM, DMARC, what platforms are we using? So one of the ones that's popular right now, I think, is MX Toolbox. But you can't just singularly rely upon MX Toolbox. You've got to have a couple of ways of checking to see if they're all aligned. And where there's discrepancies, that offers you vital information. So really just ensure that you're doing several checks to make sure that are your emails landing. Similar principles, as an example, when you're checking inbox placement, are you checking it across more than one domain or one provider? So what do I mean by that is that what will often happen within your own business is that you'll be like, right, let me send a test email to me, Deepak, but I just am on Google Workspace. I'm not on Outlook. So how do I know whether my emails are landing in Outlook? Maybe they land in Gmail, but they don't land in Outlook. So you need to make sure you have testing for both Gmail as well as Outlook. And what you'll often find is that the testing is not comprehensive, that people aren't doing actual proper rigorous testing. So make sure what you do is you look at ultimately the providers that are the most typical, and then you have a testing infrastructure to check those. Because if you think about it in the world of development, it's almost like saying, right, I've checked on my websites on desktop, but I'm not going to check mobile because we don't use mobile much as a company. You'd be like, well, that's crazy. So many people are on mobile. So if you just, for example, and this is what will often happen that I see within companies when they're doing testing inbox placement. They test based upon what they use internally, but in the business world, as an example, and this is the logical part, this is where I still think based upon, in the business world, look up the statistics in the regions that you're in, that you're doing business in, and look up the type of platform that most people use. So as an example, if you're checking at an industry level, in this industry, most people are probably going to be using Outlook. If they're in offices, then it does make sense to use Outlook as an email sending provider. So then when you begin to get really tactical, you can begin to align infrastructure with ICP. So how many of these types, like what is in this industry typically used? You know, so many people, even when they work from home, they use Outlook as a provider to get their desktop mail. So then it does make sense to use Outlook if you say in this niche particularly, because we're targeting CTOs within security, CTOs, and these types of companies tend to use Outlook, or they tend to use, we're targeting startups. A lot of them are using Google Workspace. Let's use Google Workspace for this niche. So thinking about it in these terms, I think does then begin to become important. And then of course you've got all of these other elements. Do the messages land with images, links in text, obvious warning banners? So just checking when you receive these emails, do they land in the inbox? Are they landing in spam? What are they doing? And that will then necessitate the various kind of interactions and considerations. And yeah, again, as you see here, TLS encryption. I'll be honest and say, and this is the important part, I at this stage am not sure exactly what TLS is, but what's important is that if you've done your due diligence properly from a compliance perspective, you'll say, great, I know what that is. I've looked into it and I'm going to make sure that that's done. But as you says here, if you use major providers, that's usually handled, which is why I probably don't know it, because it's usually handled. But you still want to verify mail has been sent over TLS. Google's compliance posture includes encryption as a sender side factor. So just double checking that, is TLS encryption enabled across your entire ecosystem? So as you can see, guys, monitoring from day one, you need to monitor bounce rate, reply rate, all of these things at a monitoring level. And even here, if Outlook starts junking or blocking you, Microsoft guidance points to their sender support channels once authentication is already correct. So what this points out is that there's things that you can do from an escalation perspective to investigate before you potentially trash domains or otherwise. But these, and whilst not comprehensive, I think that the important thing to think about when it comes to cold email infrastructure is, one, if you understand why it's important and understand how it would work in the real world, you can then begin to make sure that as you run through all of the campaigns that you're running for your own business internally, or if you're running for clients, that you've got all of your ducks in order, if you will. And as you'll begin to see, it has actual significant knock-on effects for then some of the elements that you're going to be working on when we get to list building, when we get to building out your ICP and so forth. So they are some of my insights into cold email infrastructure. So I'll now I'll go around the room and let's just quickly get one or two people's main key takeaway in terms of, what was the key thing that you thought, oh, I didn't think about it like that, or I didn't know that. So who would like to go? If I can just hear from anyone who's happy to kind of comment. Yeah, go ahead, Ayush.
Like you told, like we do our SPF, DMARC, DNS test, like we do for our email that we buy, but we can also provide for the client that we are getting. It may be like really beneficial, and the client will think like they are doing something great, and it will help in client retention for future. It may help in that. Other than that, there are two more type of DNS, like reverse DNS and forward DNS. I get to know it today. I will definitely work on it and see if our all the email IDs have this record or not.
Perfect. Amazing. Thank you, Ayush. Really appreciate that. So good. Absolutely, you can provide value to the clients. Who would like to go next?
Yeah, hi Deepak. So it's like I have been also doing this, cold emailing for the first time, and basically understanding the concepts and grabbing the things. I will be going through all the documents again and again, and got to understand this, and yeah.
Okay. All right, cool. No worries. Let's go to Saima.
Yes, as you have said, Deepak, that we have to always have a look at the DNS and all the emails are connected through it. We must assure that these are working properly, which gets us a better functioning of cold email.
All right, great. Look, let's just if there's anything else from anyone else, let me know. Otherwise, we'll take a 5-minute break. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I'll add one to on behalf of the team is where you made mention of that when we are trusting the cold email platforms that we are using to detect all the positive replies and that, okay, we are getting all the leads or the positive responses. There always is a possibility, however small it might be, but there could be some emails which get missed, or so we need to be looking periodically, do random tests at the actual inboxes as well. So what we can do is, guys, we can discuss it. When we set up the email accounts, we set up a email account level forwarding to one common email account that we will monitor on one side, so that we don't have to look at 10-15 email inboxes. All their replies are forwarded to one inbox and we just monitor the responses from there. So in parallel to what we see on the platform, we're also having a look at one consolidated inbox to see nothing is being missed, or these leads have already been covered from Mailshake or Instantly or Reach Inbox, whatever it is. So that was one important takeaway for me.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarab. No, I really appreciate that. Okay, guys. So you can take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to move to the next session where we're going to be talking about building ultimately your ICP. So I'll meet you back in 5 minutes. Okay. So we've covered cold email infrastructure. Now I want to talk about building out your ICP. So your ideal customer profile, your avatar, basically the people and or companies that you're going to target. Okay. So this is in many respects central to how you run cold email campaigns. It's like, who are we going to target? And a little bit like cold email infrastructure, I think that oftentimes not enough thought is put into the nuances and specifics that relate to targeting, because it's not simply just a case. The classic reductive way of thinking about targeting is that I'm looking to target marketing managers because I've got a software that I want to sell to marketing managers, and I want to target marketing managers, companies that have 100+ employees, because it's going to help them run ultimately their internal social media campaigns. Okay, because it's a competitor to Agora Pulse or to any premium enterprise social media management tool. And that's what I'm going to look at. So what you'll often find, if we take that as an example, hey, we're a social media scheduling software tool. We look at targeting enterprises that have, campaigns that are running. So we want to target marketing managers at companies with 100+ employees that are, for example, running social media campaigns. And what that, for example, can often miss is, do we have a knowledge of companies, for example, procurement and or buying cycles? So when they're in the market, do we have a knowledge of whether this social media scheduling platforms tools that it allows you to schedule, let's just say it focuses, for example, primarily it's got the most advanced metrics for Facebook and Instagram. Are we looking at companies that are in a space where they're targeting platforms that use Facebook and Instagram? So it's not just the actual companies that use social. Is it the right platforms related to social? And then is it at the right time of their buying cycle for when they buy? And then if we say we're targeting marketing managers, who's involved in the decision matrix? Should we really be looking at marketing managers, or actually, rather than looking at a profile level, should we be looking at an account level? Which is why account-based marketing begins to become more important when you're thinking about targeting, because you want to look at company level signals, and then from company level signals deduce basically who's involved in the decision making flow, because it might be, and often is, multiple individuals that are involved in the decision making flow. So this is just a simple example of how you can not really think intently enough about ultimately what you need to do as related to targeting. So with that in mind, let's go through targeting in general as related to cold email campaigns. And I think that this is a session that I'm kind of quite excited about, because I think there's a lot within this that people don't give ultimately enough consideration to when it comes to targeting. This is really interesting. Okay, so the first kind of rule, that's the uncommon rule, is that pain intensity beats profile neatness. Ultimately is not about fitting the profile. It's about how painful is the problem I solve inside this business. Okay, so it's not just a case of, yep, you're an ideal company. Is it, does this company currently have a pain with their current process? Okay, and that's the part that ultimately becomes important, because as you can see here, it's not just a question of Firmographics, which we'll come to later, which is, if you think about like demographics, if some of you are familiar with the word demographics, talk to me about your demographic. And demographic might be, okay, my individual is probably between 30 to 35 years old, engaged or recently married, based in the UK, typically working in a job, salary maybe earning X, and he or she is already living with their partner. This would be an example of demographics. Is this making sense, guys, when I talk to you about demographics? Okay, so firmographics are the equivalent, but for companies. So companies of this size, this geography, this industry, and they would be firmographics. Okay, so just something that is useful to keep in mind, because when I got into this space, I didn't understand what the term firmographics meant. So I thought I'd make an assumption that maybe some of you guys don't also. So most people just look at firmographics, but you need to also look ultimately, as it says here, at contextual relevance. So not only do we look at the companies that are ideal, but how much is these companies, or which companies will experience pain with these problems. So that's where we need to begin to think about it. And if we take the example of, and you know, this isn't a pre-prepared example, but if we take the example of, look, I've got enterprise social media scheduling software, and I want to target companies that, you know, use social media scheduling software. The key frame to think about is that how many people have pain with scheduling social media at, for example, an enterprise level. So then what we might look at as an example is, well, how many companies have marketing managers that are in a space where they need to make pushes on social for example, and then we might think about, well, who is their end customer? So if the main, for example, goal of the social media scheduling software is that we're very strong on Meta, so Facebook, Instagram, we're very, very strong on, and we also maybe do TikTok as an example. So with that in mind, you might say, great, so we can then look at a younger demographic. So we'll look at the 7 to 15 age range, and then we want to potentially look at companies that are in the fast moving consumer goods space. So companies that sell, for example, yogurt, okay? Like yogurt for children, yogurt for primary school children. And then not only that, maybe we then want to look at, well, which companies in the last 6 months have released a new yogurt or making a big brand push, because then they're going to be heavily using social media. So do you begin to see now how most companies will often stop at, I'm just looking at a marketing manager in companies that are 100 plus that use social media. What we're looking for is ultimately intent signals. Okay. So as you can see here, it says that they're defined by how exposed are they to the problem, how expensive the problem is, how visible the problem is internally, how embarrassing and risky it is to leave it unsolved. Okay. So we gave the example of social media. And one of the ways to look at it is to identify at an account-based level. Okay. So if we think about it at an account-based level, and there's an example of SEO here, but let's continue with the example of an enterprise social media software. That what you need to think about is not only, okay, great, so we have a social media scheduling software. We want to target companies at 100 plus, frankly, because our profile, our platform starts at £1,000 a month and above. And we focus specifically on Meta, so Instagram and Facebook. So then you say, okay, great. So we need to look at anyone who's involved in social media publishing and procurement, probably within companies that are 100 plus. But we also need to look at companies that would heavily have a use for social media. So that then needs to be companies that, for example, sell stuff related to a target demographic that's most popularly on social media platforms. So then that might be great. A 15-year-old is often on Instagram. So we need to look at what kind of products these companies are selling to 15-year-olds. And then we need to look at companies that are actively pushing product. Maybe they've got a new launch or otherwise that is for that avatar. And then you could also look at their competitors and have a look at who the ideal customers are for the competitors based upon some of the reviews they've got, as well as some of their own case studies, and say, okay, I'm beginning to get a sense of the ideal subset of companies within that niche. And then based upon that, what you'll begin to understand is that a lot of people do the spray and pray approach, but doing account-based research and then identifying 50 companies that could have, for example, a use based upon active signals in the market. Okay, so we've identified from our thinking there's 50 companies that look like they're ideal, and within that there's potentially 5 different roles that exist within each of these 50 companies, okay, that could be involved in the decision making process. So then all of a sudden you got 50 times 5, which is 1,500 contacts. Then each of them might need a slightly different message when it comes to cold email, because they've got a different ultimately angle of looking at the problem. So one of them at a financial level is looking at the value versus the return. One of them would be looking maybe at the integrations. One of them is looking at the scheduling capabilities. And one of them is looking at perhaps successful case studies using your platform. So then what you discover is, if you think about it clearly, you can then begin to understand the point that asked here, which is how, as it says here, how painful is a problem I solve inside this business. Okay, so that's where you get into the world of account-based marketing, because people look at job titles, but really you should be looking at segments. Okay, so as you can see here, the best ICP is tied to budget logic, not just need. So need alone isn't enough, because when you're building your ICP, you need to think about who has the ultimately budget and who can justify the budget. So the finance director says, technically we have the budget, but then the marketing manager needs to justify the budget based upon the return on investment that they'll get. So the finance or procurement team might say, great, we have £50,000 a month or £500,000 a year to spend towards marketing. So we have a budget. But of course, to get budget approved, you need to talk about spend versus ROI. So that means that, as you can see, many teams will target businesses with a real problem, but no commercial mechanism to support it. So this is the thing that we need to also understand, is that is the problem tied to revenue, or is it tied to cost now, or risk, or speed, or status, or internal visibility? So these are really strong frames to keep in mind. So what you need to think about is, if we've got a social media scheduling tool, how can I align this with revenue rather than talking about the features? So then we get into the features and benefits mind space. But actually, how this is going to get approval internally is that I can demonstrate how our social media scheduling platform can help their company generate more sales for a brand launch that they're doing, or how it could have been used in a brand launch that they've done previously, as opposed to saying, hey, Ayush, I see you're the marketing manager at Nestle. Would love to talk to you about our social media scheduling platform and how we might use it, versus, hey, Ayush, I noticed that you guys ran a Cadbury's launch 3 months ago and would really love to show you how using XYZ social media scheduling tool, you could have got 73% more reach based upon this specific feature that will really impact your bottom line, and want to make sure that you don't miss out for your next upcoming launch. You see the difference in the quality of those two emails, and you see the difference in the thinking attached to looking at tying it to revenue. So what you want to try and do is that how can I, or is there a rationale to tie this to revenue, or to tie this to cost, or to tie this to risk? So that could be security, that could be technology, that could be, any of that type of stuff. Speed, current platforms take XYZ, we take this, and that's going to unblock your time and allow you to focus on other things within the business. Is it tied to status or internal visibility? So these areas, and that's why more leads can be vague, recovering lost pipeline stronger, reducing wasted ad spend stronger, fixing compliance risk is stronger. So the more your offer attaches to an existing budget logic, meaning, so budget logic is important because what it means is, what do we spend money on, and does it fit in with the way that we think about spending money? Okay. So people will talk about, okay, great, I've got a social media scheduling platform, I'd love to share it with these companies. And you say, okay, but you've got to tie it to why they spend money, because otherwise you need to have the justification based upon budget logic, meaning that these are things we spend money on and these are things we don't spend money on. We spend money in the end for tools that help us ultimately either increase revenue, decrease other costs, decrease risk. So you have to think about things in those terms here. And then you need to think about the framing, and this changes based upon the role within the company. So the marketing manager might care about speed of deployment because they're like, oh my God, the current providers take me hours to get things going. The actual chief financial officer will say, look, this is the cost, it's more cost effective. And the chief sales officer might say, this is going to help you generate more marketing qualified leads through our social media platform. So all of a sudden you can develop rationales to target multiple people within one organization using different messaging. And this is where we get into the world of account-based marketing, whereas typically people will target one person, but actually you can target multiple people, but they're all need different messages. So that's when you get into the world of, when you've got big enough companies, you can do 4 or 5 people per company, each with personalized emails related to their budget logic and their justification to find a way to penetrate an organization. And then, of course, this is where we already kind of discussed it, but timing is a part of ICP, but not separate from it. So clients or people, or you might often think about, this is a company that buys my product, but of course you need to look at signals. Okay, what's going on at a company level? And this is why company level insight is probably more important than individual level insight, because individuals can change within organizations, but what's happening at a company level is often, the most important thing. So you've got examples here, okay? And this is at the beginning of today's session, I spoke to you about the example that I used when we were running cold email back in 2017, I think. And what I did at that time was I would very simply look at companies that were hiring salespeople or hiring lead generation managers or business development managers that had recently come up. I would try and identify who the marketing manager or the sales manager was, and then I would send personalized cold email campaigns comparing hiring someone internally versus hiring someone that was outsourced. And that was recently hired or actively hiring around the pain area. That was one that I focused on, right? So actively hiring around the pain area. That was a key area of focus for me. The important thing is that you've got this fundamentally matrix here, recently hired into a relevant function, So that could be someone who's just been hired, so they have budget or they want to make a change. A company that was recently funded, a company that's recently expanded, a company that's underperforming on a visible channel. So that might mean that they are great socially, but they're nowhere to be seen on Google, actively hiring around the pain area, and all of these elements. Okay, so this is what's called dynamic ICPs as opposed to static ICPs. And most people get into the habit of building static ICPs, but then you're not looking at signals related to around things that are actively happening within their niche or within their niche. Okay, and then you can, if you want to, at a secondary, look at industry level insights that might relate to them. So a classic example of that is, as you can see right now, how is AI changing your business? How is AI search changing your visibility? And that's something that can be used as a wider industry frame. But if you can look at it at a company level frame based upon signals that you can identify, then you've got, you know, a much bigger opportunity for fundamentally success. So an interesting way to look at it then is, for example, rather than looking at companies that have marketing managers at 100 plus and looking at those companies, why wouldn't you look at companies that are 100 plus that are currently hiring marketing managers to then sell your social media software? Because then you know that they've already got active spend and they've got a need because they're unhappy with their social media. And that's maybe why they're looking at bringing in a new marketing manager. So that means that there's change happening within that business. So what's interesting, a way that you can inverse it is say, we're not going to go after marketing managers currently. We're going to only look at companies that have recently hired a marketing manager or companies that are currently hiring a marketing manager at the relevant salary that suggests that they've got the requisite size of business. And based upon those two signals, you're then able to demonstrate active change within the organization, which allows your involvement, your penetration to be much more effective. Because if you think about it logically, you say, you know what, I'm hiring a new marketing manager because I'm not happy with the results that we've got. And that then means also that, yeah, you know, we use this platform, we're not really getting the best results from it. And I just think that she or he has made bad decisions, or we're looking to make a change. So yeah, that's one example of how you can really think about building ICPs. Don't look for the role that they currently have, look for the role that they're currently hiring for, and or just look for people that have been recently hired. And all of a sudden you get a greater ability to build signals based upon current pain fundamentally, because that's one that's, you know, more useful to a degree than recently funded. But recently funded, of course, is always useful, and or recently expanded. And it's just a case of looking at what ultimately functions you have, whether it's LinkedIn Sales Navigator, Apollo, Zoom Info, whatever the tools might be, and then mapping that against intent and signals. So that's why the concept of dynamic ICPs, which is if you're in the agency space, is something you need to educate your clients around so that they understand that we need to take your static ICP and turn it into a dynamic ICP to whittle down to identify the target. So what will often happen if you're in the agency space is you'll work with a client to say, great, we've got 10 different ICPs. Let's pick which one we think will be the best. That's the wrong approach. You need to say, we're now going to let signals within the market determine which is the best ICP, as opposed to just looking at static ICPs, because then it's a case of the ICP is always changing, Mr. Prospect, and even for you, because we have filters that allow us to pop up intent signals based upon our target market. So at any given time, every 2 to 3 weeks, we're renewing the campaigns because new ICPs pop up, because we'll say, okay, great, a new avatar has just come up because this type of signal has appeared because 3 new companies appeared at funding level. So we're going to send emails out because they've just announced funding, and we're going to put them into our ICP. So, or we're monitoring job board filters, and we're seeing that anytime a new marketing manager job ad pops up, we're going to get those emails sent out. We're going to identify hiring managers, and we're going to send them cold emails. We're going to identify hiring managers, we're going to send them cold emails. So as you begin to look at it and think about it that way, you don't have static ICPs for targeting. You have dynamic ICPs that are married against active filters that you monitor, and then based upon that, you can then send way more targeted campaigns, lower volume of campaigns, but very much more relevant campaigns based upon what you're able to observe in the market. And in this way, you're going to see a lot more success. So as you can see, this is the other part that becomes important. The person is determined by problem ownership, not ultimately title prestige, because the right person is anyone who has one of these things, okay? And that's where having specific titles is sometimes quite dangerous, because rather you want to look at a departmental level, because different people use different naming conventions and different people have different responsibilities within different organizations. An example of it at Pearl Lemon is that we've got, our head of lead generation who's also really the chief operations officer within the business. But publicly, it might be one or it might be the other. But because he's got mixed roles, you have to look at really seniority within a business and understand that. So as you can see, CMO could be head of growth, it could be RevOps, it could be operations director, around ultimately the same role. So these people could conceivably be doing the same role. So this is why job titles and individuals don't work. You have to look at it at a company level and then budget, ownership, or decision level, and think about it in those terms, because you cannot be privy to how different companies determine job titles within organizations. So then what we're looking at ultimately is these types of areas. You've got the economic buyer, the functional owner, the internal champion, and the blocker. So they're the kind of 4 people that we need to think about. So who is the person who can approve budget, basically, or say, look, I think this is where we should spend money? Then you can look at the person who lives with the problem. Then you can look at the person who, as an example, the CFO might be the person who approves budget. The chief marketing officer might be the person who, let's call it, is the functional owner. But then the internal champion is the social media manager, because the social media manager has to really love the tool that you use. They tell the chief marketing officer. So Gabby, who runs the tool, Hootsuite, Gabby says to Frank, Gabby is the social media manager. She says, Frank, I've tried Hootsuite, really bloody good. I think we should get it. Frank says, okay, great. This is going to help you do your job. I understand. Frank will talk to George, who's the chief financial officer, saying, George, can you approve this spend? Because I think it's really good. My team uses it. So actually, there's 3 people, but then also the chief operations officer or someone else might be the blocker, saying, well, Frank, normally we do this, but budgets are tight at the moment, so we can't approve any new spend. So who are these avatars within each organization? And if you don't ultimately understand who to go after, the right person is the right person is whose incentives are most aligned with solving the problem, not the person with the flashiest title. And that's really important to keep in mind when it comes to cold email campaigns. So in any given campaign, I would say it's always safe to target 2 job titles per company. 2 job titles per company. And if you can, you have the capacity, try and do 3. To kind of, because you don't know who's going to be receptive to that email at the right time based upon their current hiring signal. So as an example, what I mean by that is, let's just say you've got a signal that a company is hiring a chief marketing officer. Okay, they're hiring a new chief marketing officer. Great. So you might look at, so first of all, you wouldn't look at their current chief marketing officer potentially, because they're about to leave the business. So they have no decision-making matrix. So that's one of the things that, but then therefore you might say, great, they're growing. We need to look at the social media manager within the business who manages tools. We also need to look at the chief financial officer. So when someone's hiring, for example, a chief marketing officer, you might say, great, we're going to then therefore target the CFO, and we're going to target the social media manager, because the CFO is going to approve budget for anything that's new right now. And then the social media manager is going to be the one who provides the recommendations for the tool for the CFO to manage. Because then otherwise what will happen, you'll target the social media manager, but she has no influence because you've not gone to the CFO. Or you target the CFO and they'll say, okay, well, I don't know. I don't care because I don't really understand any of these social media management tools. So what you need to do is try and target both of them. And then if there's any internal discussion within the company, you can say, you know what, I think these guys emailed me as well. So generally speaking, it's always sensible. If you think about the decision-making matrix, there's typically, there's always 1, but there's sometimes 3, maybe 4 people that are involved. So you want to email at least half of them. You want to email at least half of them to penetrate an organization. So this is something that's really important from a consideration standpoint. So let's also look at ultimately the other thing that becomes important. So the best ICP is often the segment where your proof is easiest to believe. So what this means is a classic mistake that I've seen happen practically is that people share irrelevant case studies. So what that means is company has a case study, but that case study can often be irrelevant to the people that you're sending it to. And sometimes that case study can do more damage than good. So the classic part of it is I see companies that will say, look, we worked with Google, and you'll be like, brilliant, but the companies that you're targeting aren't like Google. Or they are like Google. The example of how you worked with Google was totally different to how this company works. So they're going to say, cool company, but maybe it's not relevant. So what you need is as much congruency as possible. So these are the things: similar client examples, similar pain patterns, similar buyer language, similar operational context, similar deal size and urgency. We experience it at Pearl Lemon because we have hundreds of case studies, but we sometimes still get clients who say, but I need a very specific case study for a very specific similar size of business. And that's what I need as proof to feel confident that you can actually deliver based on my campaign. So what you want to do also is map what proof they have against the companies that you want to send it to. So at some level, when you're building your ICP, there needs to be some kind of filter where you say, great, this is our ICP now that we've determined it. Now, let's have a look at their case studies and tell us, based upon the ICP, which avatar are these case studies most relevant to. And LLMs might say, don't send it to these guys because it's just going to throw them. It's not going to help anything, to be honest with you. So there needs to be some intelligence behind how you map proof with relevancy, because not all proof is relevant. Does that make sense? If I say to you, Simon, in the room that, hey, I've got a Google Ads certification, you might say, I don't care about your Google Ads certifications, Deepak. Just show me how many Google Ads campaigns that you've run. Anyone can get a certification these days. Whereas, for example, Ayush might say, Deepak, I only work with people that have got Google Ads certifications. I don't know about your case study. I can't trust your case study. You might have made something up, but I trust Google Ads. So therefore, you need to make determinations around who you send or what you send to who. And people don't even think about this at all. So what are you sending to who? Okay. So trust is built, as it says here, trust is built not through reputation, but through recognition, because reputation is contextually relevant. Reputation is perception of, I've got a great reputation, and you might say, Simon, not in my industry, you haven't. I've never heard of you. I don't know who you are. So your reputation carries currency in particular areas, but recognition supersedes reputation, because when people recognize something, that's bigger than reputation. So an example is that I might have all of the personal qualifications in the world for personal training. I might have done personal training for 10 years, but then if you, for example, have Cristiano Ronaldo who says, I'm going to take you through personal training, recognition trumps reputation, because you say, I'm going to take Cristiano Ronaldo. He's just going to be better. Why? Because I recognize him and he's like a star. So it's really important to walk clients through that level of understanding, or to think about it within your business, because people don't think about it enough. They just smash case studies into a deck and you're like, dude, these case studies are just going to confuse them. And they're just not going to help. So sales does not happen in a vacuum. Trust is built through recognition. If a prospect can instantly think, this sounds like businesses like mine, you're in a stronger position. So sometimes a smaller, narrow ICP is better because your proof is denser. This is why specialists often outperform generalists and outbound, because the relevance is easier to process. So your ICP is often the best market where your case studies compress belief the fastest. So you might look at your case studies and say, how can I map your case studies to actual ICPs? And not the other way around, maybe. So be like, right, let me see your case studies. Great. Let me see what you actually did in those case studies. Great. Which companies are literally exactly like this? And maybe we should run a campaign just to those companies as well. And if that's a big, dense ICP with thousands of companies, then you can layer on intent signals. So you can say, well, you've got one really, really good case study, Mr. Client, that's really well detailed, written out. We can map this against ICPs. As it turns out, there's a lot of companies that are like this, that have a similar problem. There's 1,000 of them. Now from that 1,000, we run it through intent signals. And from the intent signals, we've got 30 companies. From the 30 companies, we're going to send them 3 emails each to the different people. That's 90 emails. We're going to personalize that campaign. And from that, we're hoping to produce 10, 15 really good appointments, because it's really personalized. It's exact case study. And this is the approach to how we could do it. So this is why sometimes a smaller, narrow ICP is better, because your proof is way, way better. And so that's an important part to think about it. And of course, this one is also important. The exclusion is important as inclusion. So ultimately, It's about identifying the anti-ICP, okay? So the anti-ICP. So we have the ICP, but who are all of the people that have slipped through the ICP that probably aren't relevant, okay? That probably aren't relevant. So when you think about your ICP, if we talk about the marketing manager, they'll be like, cool, this is a marketing manager who has this problem, but I don't think in this niche they care about social media that much, maybe, because we're looking at social media and somehow you said that, you know, our tool will be really great for construction companies that are building because they want to schedule out images on their Instagram of new developments that they've got. So it could be good for them because they want to schedule out new developments because they're big construction companies. But you might say that construction companies don't care about spending money for social media tools. They're going to just get someone on Instagram to quickly post them up. So from a buyer's psychology standpoint, you might say, oh, I think this avatar is really ideal because construction, you know, you can build a logic to support it, but then in practice, there's going to be biases that exist within that space that mean that, well, you know what? They never buy fundamentally social media tools, or construction companies take so long to buy anything like that because they're typically out on construction sites, looking at buildings, doing their job. So it has to be, for example, a mobile app that they can quickly use. What is it like on mobile? Oh, well, it's scheduling. So you don't really do scheduling on desktop. Okay, well, in this niche, the decision makers, estate agents, they'll be like, oh, real estate agents could use our social media scheduling software to schedule all of the like properties that go up. And you say, okay, but that's a very narrow segment of people because most social real estate agents are running around doing viewings. So it needs to be something on the mobile. Get rid of that niche. So do you see now how it begins to become a case of thinking about the persona and the actual day-to-day lives and perceptions and biases of niches depending upon need? And you've got to think about all of these things to help build out the anti-ICP. So as it says here, businesses are too small to feel the pain deeply. Enterprises too large for the proof that we have. Like our proof won't work with these enterprises. So maybe we need to think about it in a different way. Sectors with long procurement. So these guys in this industry, like lawyers, will slowly, they're going to look at your security, your compliance, before they even look at your social media tool. You're too new, so you're going to fail the compliance test. You're going to fail the social media test. So this becomes another problem. And you know, founder-led businesses where the founders not actually care about the function, and companies where your solution is not strategic enough to matter. It is deleting half your market. So yeah, that's a really important part of ultimately ICP building when it comes to your anti-market. Okay, as we continue, the final consideration I've got here, there's things that you should think about by defining an ICP. So it says downstream economics, not reply rates. So ultimately, if you have done your job correctly in terms of identifying the right ICP, then you're going to be targeting the right people that have a problem, have a current problem, care about spending money on the problem, and so have a problem in general. That problem surfaces now. They care about spending money on that problem, and you've got proof that matches their problem. Then you're more likely to get ultimately people who reply less but close faster, stay longer, and pay more. So what we're looking at from a measurement standpoint with the ICP is ultimately, you know, how much, you know, this is some of this is built by GPT. I don't agree with all of it, but parts of it that I do is how likely is their retention? How big is their average contract value likely to be, you know, in terms of the kind of avatar? Because what we're optimizing for, I'd say, is that part there. Average contract value is going to be bigger. Is the onboarding going to be difficult with them potentially because of the nature of the type of business they are? Sales cycle length, you know, how long do they take to do that? And then upsell potential, if we can upsell them other things depending upon their needs. So your ICP is not the segment that's easiest to reach, is the segment with the best full cycle economics. So what that means is, do they have a proper journey in terms of when they're going to buy, how they're going to buy, and if they're going to stay when they buy? Because there might be, for example, businesses that you say that are ideal, but you'll say, look, in this industry, because they don't value what you're selling, they're probably not going to stay with you very long. Because even if you convince them in 3 months, they're like, oh, you know what? Like, it's a lot of money. I don't really care. And I don't experience a pain or care about the pain I'm experiencing or care about the value enough to really make a downstream determination. So it's again where I take you back to the construction example, to the real estate example. Maybe there's, for example, an e-commerce business. So you say, look at me families for e-commerce, they're releasing lots of products all the time. But to be honest with you, they use social media, but they don't rely on it for generating sales, because all of the sales goes through ads that goes through their website. So they'll say, you know what? We don't want to pay £1,000 a month for a social media scheduling tool. We're happy on the medium package of Hootsuite, which is $99 a month, because we just schedule it out, but actually we're running ads to our actual site. So again, you need to think about not the reply rates, but the downstream economics. And again, a lot of this comes from thinking about your ICP in detail. So from the top, we've been talking about pain intensity beats profile neatness. How much do they experience the actual pain? How painful it's a problem that I say solve inside this business. Then you got the best ICP is ties to budget logic, not just need. So is the problem tied to revenue, or is it tied to cost? Is it tied to risk? Is it tied to speed, or ultimately invisibility? Speed or status or internal visibility? Then that's where you can think about what you can build in terms of copy, because you can identify what their needs are. Timing is part of the ICP. We discussed this in great detail, not separate from it. So are they recently hiring? Have they recently funded? Have they recently expanded? Are they underperforming in the SERPs while they're great on, for example, social? Are they entering a more competitive market because you see an announcement of entering, Asia or something like that? So a static ICP is weaker than the dynamic ICP. Then you've got the right person being determined by problem ownership, not just titles. Titles can be misleading. Titles are different in different organizations, and therefore we've got to think about who owns the problem, what departments own the problem, what people are connected therefore to the problem. And that's where, as you can see, different titles ultimately can mean the same thing, which is where it becomes confusing if you just focus on titles. So that's where you think about the economic buyer, the functional owner, the internal champ, and then the blocker. These four people are important when we think about, who the ICP is. And then proof density. So does your proof bear relevancy to the people that you're ultimately trying to target? So is your proof worthy to the people that care about it? And that's where we talk about that whole concept that recognition is more important than reputation. So you'll take recognition above reputation, because reputation is contextual and perceived, but recognition stands above ultimately reputation. Reputation can often build recognition, but recognition will trump reputation. So that's that part there. Then exclusion is as important as inclusion. So that's where you've got ultimately the anti-ICP. Who are we not targeting? Who is irrelevant? Is this company too large? Is this company too small? Does this sector take too long to buy anything? Do they have low urgency? Do they have high complexity? Do they have found a little bit, they don't care about this function in general? So you delete half your market through this. And then ultimately we're looking, if you've done all of that, then your ICP should be judged by downstream economics, i.e. it means that you're looking at companies that are the ideal type of company because they are likely to reply. They've got a need right now. They're hiring in the market for the problem, and you're targeting the right people within that organization to ensure that you're getting the reply that you're looking for. And if you follow these fundamentals, you'll have a lot more success with cold email. And as you'll see from this discussion, there's way more to building out an ideal customer that people really think about. They don't think about it with enough depth. They don't think about it with enough detail. And if you begin to build all of this in, you're gonna have a lot more success with cold email. So we will now again take another break for 5 minutes, and it's 11:20. I'll see you back here in 5 minutes, and we'll continue with the next section, which will be focused on looking at cold email list building. So that's how to build lists effectively. So let's go ahead and talk now about cold email list building. So we've discussed cold email infrastructure, all of the important things that relate to building proper cold email infrastructure to make sure that you actually have deliverability. As we've discussed, it's all contingent. So companies will often get one aspect of it wrong because they don't pay enough attention to it. But great infrastructure, poor email copy, no leads. Great email copy, no infrastructure, no deliverability. Great email copy, great infrastructure, great copy, wrong person, irrelevant leads. So they're different versions of the same thing, which is net negative. So with that in mind, that was cold email infrastructure. And then of course we're talking about the ICP, and probably the biggest takeaway being that most people are almost people that you'll find if you're an agency owner, or if you're building your own avatar is that they think in terms of static ICP. So I build a profile or I build several avatars who could buy my service, but we don't think of it in terms of dynamic ICPs, i.e., what intent signals can we discern that mean that you have a roving set of ICPs based upon what's currently happening in the market. Good example being that why don't we only look at hiring managers, or rather marketing managers that have recently been hired? Or why don't we look at companies that are hiring marketing managers currently because there's a signal that they're open to change currently in the market? Or why don't we have a look at someone who's running a campaign currently that would be relevant to them taking on our tool? So if we're selling a social media tool, why not then look at companies that are actively currently using a social media tool as part of a large campaign that they're running, and potentially they're also hiring people in the marketing department, which tells you that they're subject and open to change. So that'd be an example of a dynamic intent signal that can change week to week or month to month, depending upon if you've got signals set up, people that pop up into what would be a dynamic roving ICP. Most companies will think about it in a static fashion, but the ideal avatar is someone who's got a need right now, as opposed to being an ideal avatar, but it's not relevant for me in general, or it's not relevant right now because decisions have already been made, or we don't have a campaign running at the moment, so I'm not going to spend on a brand new tool when I'm not going to make active use of it really until 3 months down the line. So all of these things become important. And why that's important is that if you've got your infrastructure set up correctly, and then you've got your ICP thought out correctly, then we get into the world of list building. What will typically happen is that people would quickly jump into any of the tools that are available to you, right? We discussed the tools always change over time: Apollo, Zoom Info, LinkedIn Sales Navigator, but the thinking hasn't been applied correctly. So therefore the tools will, you think, lead you, but actually they'll mislead you because you've not thought about ultimately all of the principles as related to the ICP. But we thought about it now, and we're going to continue with this kind of narrative thread that we've no longer got the watch example, as we spoke about with BBC and Forbes, a weird watch example. Now we've got Bootsuite, which is a competitor to Hootsuite. It's the social media software tool that starts at £1,000 per month. We're looking at companies that are 100 plus, that are enterprise, that have a need for Bootsuite, the competitor to Hootsuite. And we're going to think about that in mind as we go through the principles of list building based upon everything that we've discussed to see where that takes us. So I'll go ahead with that in mind and just share my screen. So as we discussed already, start with the list strategy and not the tool. Most companies, of course, will start with Apollo, Sales Navigator, and Clay and say, look, who can I pull from this? Who can I pull from this data set? And that fundamentally isn't the right approach in general. The right approach is to think about, well, who feels the pain right now? Who has the budget, and what triggers that make them care, and what evidence makes them believe you're relevant? Okay, so what we've got is fit. Are you a fit based upon XYZ signal? Is the timing right now ideal based upon the type of company or the type of tool that we're looking at? And what about reachability? So as we discussed, there's Firmographics. Okay, so when we think about the jargon or the technical terms, you've got a demographic, which is an individual avatar. I target George. He's 35 years old. He's a marketing manager. He's probably about to get married, or he's living in with his partner. He's looking at making a move of his career. He has just got a role as a marketing manager at Nestle. We're targeting companies such as Nestle, and George is our avatar. He XYZ. So that's an example of a demographic. Okay. A firmographic is we're targeting companies such as Nestle. So it's the company equivalent of demographics. So the firmographic is we're targeting companies that are 100 plus employees. They're UK based. They are active in social media. They therefore target their ideal client is anyone from 5 to 20 years old. So they're potentially FMCG companies, fast moving consumer goods. So we're going to look at companies such as L'Oreal. We're going to look at companies such as Nestle, and that's an ideal market for us. And then you've got Technographics. So Technographics we can see that they've got pixels installed based upon technology that they use ad campaigns, because we see on their website they've got a Google pixel, they've got a LinkedIn pixel, and they've got a Facebook pixel. So therefore they match from a technographic perspective. And then from a timing perspective, we can see there's operational signals because they are doing a new launch in Asia, specifically the Chinese market. And we can see that they're making a huge hiring push in China. And therefore you've got elements of ultimately what's happening from them based upon change and growth within the business. Okay, so then based upon all of this, that's how you can then begin to combine targeting. And most people don't combine them all together. They think them all as separate threads, but when you combine it, then you necessarily get small tactical lists, and it's the strategy that then becomes important, because otherwise you don't really appropriate the tools in the correct fashion. So basics is, of course, where you begin, which is the firmographics. So what's the industry, what's the geography, what's the employee count? And for those of you who are in the agency space, what this might mean is that we could rebuild our onboarding forms to make consideration of intent signals that they're aware of. And we could think about what application does this have to intake. If you're thinking about it within your department or within your organization, what impact does that have in terms of your thinking in respect of fundamentally who we should be going after? Furthermore, why not, as an example, if I'm thinking of some of the people that are a bit more advanced, why not look at the filters that we use within, for example, LinkedIn Sales Navigator or otherwise, and why not build them into the onboarding forms? Why not look at the filters that are available and ask clients to give their opinions of what they think is best fit? Now, you shouldn't singularly be led by the clients because they won't do this level of thinking, but you can get some level of insight from them based upon all of these areas. So you think about demographic of the individual, you think about firmographics of the company, you think about technographics, and then you think about intent signals. So they're the 4 buckets that you want to think about when it comes to building lists and strategic intent, because absent them, you can very quickly get the right firmographics. We've got the right company size, but we didn't look at technographics. The companies that we're targeting, only 10% of them actually have pixels installed. So if they're not running ads, why are they going to spend £1,000 a month on social media management software? It's just illogical, because they're not. To spend £1,000 a month on social media scheduling, you need to be spending £10,000 to £50,000 a month running ads, because you've got a huge social media machine that's working. And where you don't, it's just not going to be relevant. You're going to get maybe some interesting replies, but you're not going to get true buyer commitment because the need isn't there. So that's something that will often come up when it comes to building strategic intent around lists. Okay. So then we've got, of course, what we spoke about with the firmographics. I think this part is relatively self-explanatory. You think about your industry, you think about your geography. So you might say, great, we are a social media software company. And the thing to think about this, actually, when you think about firmographics, is, look, we're a social media company, Deepak, and we target companies that are, for example, enterprise, and we start at £1,000 plus. And I'd look at their business and I'd say, well, you're clearly a German-based company, and I don't think you targeting American companies is going to work, because the nature of this business is that they're going to need onboarding, they're going to need demos, and they're going to want that sense of someone feeling local, even where your technology. Let's just look at the EU, because I think this is going to fall down upon due diligence when they understand that you're just far away from them. And there's a psychology to proximity that people find when it comes to comfort. So I would still build in some psychology to thinking about ultimately their industry and their geography, because people will often say, look, we can target anyone from anywhere, but that doesn't mean anyone from anywhere will be a buyer of your services. So you've got to think about it in both those elements, because we might say, look, Mr. Prospect, and you can think about it with your own client or with your own business, that if you're based in the UK, there's so many signals that you have that demonstrate that you're a UK based business. And if you say, look, we could sell to Australians, the question also, though, is, in the face of alternatives, would an Australian firm buy from a British firm when they can see that you're a British firm, when it's not self-service? Okay. And if you're selling at an enterprise level, most of it isn't self-service, because there's onboarding and there's support and there's customer tickets, and people know this. And if they can understand that, well, you're not really a local based business, some of these factors come into play. Okay. So as you go through it, you can think about these elements, pretty straightforward. Industry, geography. So industry might be fast moving consumer goods. In geography could be the UK. Employee count could be 100 plus, because we're going to sell Bootsuite, right? Our social media software for companies that use social media. Revenue band, they're going to be 100 plus, but they're doing at least 20 million a year. Then we've got company type. We said FMCG. So I guess that's a subset of an industry, which might be, product-based businesses. And then role seniority. Then if we're selling at £1,000 plus, then we're going to look at the marketing department, and we're going to look at the maybe sales department, because marketing is attached to sales, because you have NQLs and you have SQLs. So sales are going to get involved as a consequence, potentially. Or maybe we're not going to look at it, because if it's social media software, then we're going to run people back to our website to buy our product. So maybe sales aren't involved at all, but then you've got the marketing department, and then maybe you've got the procurement department because they've got procurement, and procurement only listen when you get stuff coming in through sales, through marketing, and then you've got maybe the finance department. So what you want to do though anyway in any event, as it says, is move quickly from TAM, so total addressable market, to micro segments. Most people will look at one giant ICP, but then you need to split your market into buying clusters. So this part becomes really important because there's so many variations within that. So a buying cluster might be, look, there's companies that are 100 plus Deepak, and they are retail companies that also have an e-commerce side of it, and they schedule stuff. They're very different in terms of buyer psychology from FMCG companies. So you need to separate them out. Then also, if you look at retail companies, there's retail companies that have an e-commerce part of their business, and they're very likely to spend on social media software. And then there's retail companies that don't really do much on social media because they have physical stores. So they're just wrong, or they might require a different approach. And then you've got companies where, look, all of these companies are, as it says here, companies at the 100 plus level, they've got a very small buying committee. Okay. So by the way, the concept of the buying committee are all of the people that are involved within the buying decision. So you might think about, well, who's the buying committee? Who are the people that at any level will be involved in buying this product or buying this service? And what are we doing to address their questions? So when you think about buying committee, it's not that, oh, it's a CFO. You'd be like, well, this is founder-led businesses. It can just be the founder alone. But even in a company of 10 people, there's typically 2 people that are involved. So what often gets missed when you think about micro segments is even at a company of less than 10 headcount, typically, if the product is expensive, the founder will consult at least one person, maybe even 2 people. So even at a small level, it's worth targeting potentially 2 people, because very often, for example, in our business with an ID generation department, they might identify per lemon and say, great, I'm going to go after Deepak to introduce him to new sales software, which is exactly what happened recently. What happened? I kicked them downstairs, or I kicked them across to Sorab to review and to run that due diligence. So actually, the more effective approach would have been to go to Sorab directly and him to come up to me as the internal champion. And that would have been more effective. Or they could have messaged us both and seen what would have happened to get further insight. So thinking about micro segments begins to become really important, because you want to look for signals. So if we think about our social media software, then Bootsuite, we should only target companies that are potentially running ads or currently active on social media. So when we build a filter to say, look, we want to target companies that would make use of our social media tool, we'll say, great, we must only look at companies that have been active in the last 30 days on social media, or 60 days in a big way. Everyone else, they're probably not using social media, or they're not using it often enough for it to be relevant. So we might say, great, what does that mean in terms of the people that we need to target? Is there a filter to allow us to target people that are active? And if it's not on the platform that we're using, where can we get alternate signals to demonstrate that? So, are they active in the space within which we intend to sell them a software product? Or are they active within the space where they are, for example, intending to take on our technology services? So a good example might be, if we think about Technographics now. So great, we've got Bootsuite, and it requires a technology integration because there's API access, and that part's quite technical. So we want to look at companies that have, is there a way to check if they've recently installed pixels on their website, or they've recently made updates at a technology level to their company? Because then we can tell that they're comfortable with adaptive technology, which is going to be an important part of the actual sales process. So again, we need to think about some of these considerations. So what happens is that people have TAMs, but they don't think deeply enough about some of the micro segments as related to list building. So as we think about it with Bootsuite, we might say, okay, great, well, our tool's more advanced than Hootsuite, but that does require a little bit of technology integration, because we want to install it directly to their website so it can pull products from their Google Ads inventory and then dynamically update social media in line with that. So we're like, great, so there's technology integration there, there's social media impact. So that means that it expands the buying committee because there's technology involvement. So that, how does that adjust the people that we go after, and how does that adjust that? And that's where we come to, of course, it says Technographics. So that's where we look at what software they use, whether they're using a competitor, whether they're missing a category you provide, whether they've recently changed stack. And that's the one that I referred to. What tools allow us to determine what's happening with their technology stack, and what signals can we find from their technology stack to segment it further still. Because what you want to develop, as it says up here, is micro segments within macro segments based upon relevancy. So Technographics is a good way to do it. And when it comes to, of course, the social media boot suite, I would say great. Who are our competitors? Great. What signals are there that exist in the marketplace to determine whether someone's currently using a competitor, so we can get them or convince them to switch? So what signals exist to do that, right? So if we're another classic example that comes up within, for example, Pearl Lemon, is that, look, we're looking to look for companies or businesses that are looking to invest in new products. So what signals can we determine that they're people that are actively investing right now? What signals exist to demonstrate that? So rather than just saying, if you're going to look for that, we want to raise money, we want you to go after retail investors, or we want you to go after like family offices. So are there portals that disclose who is invested in what? Or are there ways that we can determine when people are making investments? Number one. And number two, what about, can we look at, if we're looking at investments, like certifications that allow people to make redemptions or money back or tax efficient ways of doing investments? And where does that have relevancy right now within the tax season? So the tax season's just passed. I'm currently doing preparing for the new tax year. What does that mean in terms of investments? Like, what signals are there that exist in the market? So there's always going to be different signals, and Technographics is just one of them. And what we need to do then, as you can see here with number 5, is that intent is what separates who could buy from who might buy now. And what we're looking for is who might buy now. Everyone builds the could buy list. They could buy our list. We think they'd be good, but who might buy it now? And what rationale is there for them to buy it right now? And that's where we need to ultimately figure out what it is that we can determine. And as you can see here, intent filters are being pushed really hard right now because it's all about timing. So right person, right company at the right time. Always, because there's been seasons where I've spent a lot of money on software, and if you catch me within my right buying cycle, then you're going to get spend from me. Because there was a time, for example, as a company, that we spent £25,000 to £50,000 a year on technology tools. Then now I'm not in that buying cycle anymore, because we're building tools internally to replace a lot of our paid tools. So if someone was to approach me now, they would see that, well, I'm not in the buying cycle to make me a relevant buyer right now, even though on paper I might look like the right buyer. So timing is massively important, because that's what we need to try and figure out, what we can use to identify what triggers exist within the tools that we have, and how can we map all of those filters that are available to us with logical triggers that would make a company relevant. It is never just about the ICP. It's about relevancy right now to the product or service that you're selling, because otherwise people that are seemingly relevant on paper become totally irrelevant because you're not caught them at the right time. There's seasons that people tend to make purchases in at a personal level. So when people are preparing to enter, for example, a marathon, that might be the time in which you buy new running trainers, you buy new running kit, you upgrade your Strava subscription, because you're in a buying season as related to something that you are committing to. Companies operate in the same way depending upon what happens, and that can sometimes be led by economic cycles, financial cycles of the financial year, or other cycles, and you look for signals of it that you can find online. And that's why trigger-based lists, if we can build them, outperform static lists. Okay, one of the best upgrades that you can make is thinking about lists in terms of triggers, not thinking about lists in terms of titles, but triggers. So events beats demographics. Okay, so that's why also targeting job titles alone isn't always ideal, because it's account first, contact second. And these two kind of come together because it's a better way to think about, or how we identify the right people for your product. It's about seeing what triggers currently exist in the marketplace. And every industry will have different triggers. We spoke about boot suite, right? I.e. the triggers would be, well, do they have pixels that show that they spend or care about ads and they have a technology integration? Is there a way to detect using SpyFu or anything, whether there's companies that are currently running ads right now, are there companies where we can detect that they've recently launched a product or they've got plans to launch a product? All of these things might mean that we've got a very specific list for Bootsuite that becomes relevant. Okay, if it's a case of, okay, hey, we want to take another example, we want to sell software development services. Companies tend to buy things also in seasons as related to software. So can we identify companies that have recently installed something new on their website? So looking at Technographics as related to recent installation or updates typically tends to demonstrate that they're in the season of spending on product. Potentially, right? The decision could have been happened months ago and they finally run the installation. But these are good examples of the way that you use triggers to determine targets, and not think about targets and then see, well, what triggers can I find? You could start with a trigger first approach. And that's why, as it says here, that ultimately is define the target accounts. So instead of 10,000 heads of marketing, you think, let me define the target companies. Let's rank those companies and let's find the right people within them. And that really is the better way to do it. And that's when you get role mapping rather than title mapping. So we've got triggers as related to Technographics. Well, Firmographics first, then you look at Technographics if you can, and then you look at intent signals, and that will typically give you accounts and not people. And people, typically, companies tend to start with people. They just start by going, let's go into LinkedIn Sales Navigator, let's start with people, and let's have a look at the filters. But there's at an account level, there's a different way to do it fundamentally as related to accounts. And that's where, as we discussed about it, role mapping. And we discussed this in the previous segment where we spoke about the types of people to go after. And as we said, you need the economic buyer, the day-to-day operator, the influencer, the blocker, and the end user. So who's the economic buyer in the context of, for example, Bootsuite or Pearl Lemon? Let's say in Bootsuite, the economic buyer could be the actual CFO who says, look, I'm going to sign and I'm going to approve this budget. The day-to-day operator could be the social media analyst who's actually using the tool to analyze data and to schedule. The influencer could be one of the senior marketing managers or the CMO who says, look, my team use it and I think this is going to be used. The blocker could be it could potentially be that same person, or it could be one of the other users of the current tool. And we've already spoken about the end user. So instead of only targeting the CEO, as you see, you might pull all of these people, and then your sequencing can reflect probable ownership. So who owns this decision? And as you can see from this example, it's given you, the CEO could decide, the CMO is a day-to-day operator, the influencer is a head of growth, the blocker is the SEO lead, because they might say, forget social media, we use SEO, let's take that budget and let's spend it on SEO. And what that means is that you wouldn't target the SEO lead, but you maybe need to build in some point literature to suggest that, this is why this is a great spend alongside SEO. And then, of course, we've got like freshness ultimately, which is up-to-date information. I won't really go over that too much, but this is make sure the lists aren't that old, make sure that you always validate and make sure that it's a list that's fundamentally updated. Now, waterfall enrichment, Clay talks about this a lot, but fundamentally the concept is just, use multiple databases, pull from multiple sources to fill in gaps where you have them, because that will help you build stronger intent signals. Now, if, Clay says single source list building leaves money on the table, multi-source enrichment should be standard, one volume matters. I think the principle here is validate, verify, and check with multiple sources to get complete information. So that's really a good practical example at a small level. If you're thinking, well, I'm not going to use Clay, is that you look at GPT to get insights on a business, but then you also do manual research to inform and to validate areas where there might be gaps, because ChatGPT won't pull everything. So if you think about it in those simple terms, it is sensible just to use enrichment to make sure that you get the most comprehensive and up-to-date data. And that becomes really important. So waterfall enrichment is a technical term, and you could say that part of what we do is waterfall enrichment if you're on the sales side. But as a company, if you're doing research, make sure you check you don't single source data fundamentally, and that you triple source data, and that way you're more likely to get complete up-to-date information. Verification is one of the last elements of it. So again, I think that this is pretty self-explanatory, but you'll get grading based upon the tools that we use. I think we use there's Never Bounce, there's Clear Out, there's different tools that ultimately work on verification. Just make sure that you're thinking about the types of emails that you want to send to. So valid, acceptable, risky, disposable, unknown, invalid. And ultimately you send to all valid and you use caution and accept all, and then you get rid of the rest. That's the way to think about it. And what you'll often find is the valid list significantly reduces the total actual addressable list. So that's that part there. And then finally, I say finally, a couple more elements. So we spoke about filters with ICPs. You want to also build filters with job titles as you build lists. So negative filters to make sure that when you're building lists, you think about all of these things. Small companies, agencies already using you, existing customers, students, competitors, consultants, free email domains, countries you don't serve, recent unsubscribes, recent bounce contacts, roles without pain or influence. And this will just ultimately improve reply quality because you just get rid of irrelevancy. So the key is with this is just to use your common sense. But a lot of people just miss these things because they're not diligent enough when it comes to doing their checks, because you haven't thought carefully through about all of the companies we should exclude. So we've got anti-ICP, and therefore we've got anti-individual as well. So who are the individuals we should also be knocking off that might slip through the filters? Because sometimes people, as an example, and this is important, sometimes people say student / CEO / trader / entrepreneur, and it comes up in your entrepreneurs list or it comes up in your CEO list. Be in the habit of manually scanning lists when you pull them out, just for a minute or two, if you're building big lists, and check, is this list making sense? Or is there stuff on here that's silly? There will always be stuff that doesn't make sense. Almost always. So you need to do some tidying up of lists to determine if there's stuff that shouldn't be on there that somehow slipped through the filters, often because you didn't build your exclusions properly. So you didn't build a massive exclusion, ultimately, list of all of the things that you should get rid of. So these are some of the things to think about when it comes to ultimately list building, that think about your exclusions carefully enough. And then you've got message market fit. So that means that you have companies that fit your ICP, but then ultimately your outreach might not match the ICP. So it needs to be not just about the service, but also, you know, the claim that you're making. So with Bootsuite, a practical example of this is that you might, or you can target any company that has a use for social media scheduling at £1,000 a month mark, particularly companies that are using social media in a way that fits their sales. But then ultimately you might say that this will help you increase, for example, your revenue from campaigns that you run, which means that it's only relevant for companies that are selling from social media. So there's companies that might use social media, such as, for example, real estate companies or construction companies, but they might say, that's not how we sell though. So they might be relevant, but they don't fit your angle because they don't sell from social media. So if your claim is, this is going to help you increase social media sales using our software because it integrates with a TikTok shop or an Instagram shop, and then you can sell directly through social, that's not going to fit all companies. So you've got to think about your message market fit and not just your ICP fit. And then also with that in mind, that will only potentially be ideal for a certain segment of your ICP. So just thinking about that ultimately. So you're going to have different hypotheses. And when it comes to advanced outbound, you have different hypotheses and you build different lists. So, you know, as you can see here, different intent signals might need different messaging. Okay. So therefore you can have one avatar, right? So we target for Bootsuite companies at 100 plus that use social media, but then all of the messages might change based upon the different intent signals. So you might say, right, for intent signal number 1, I'm going to use this campaign. For intent signal so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my ICP of 1,000 companies and I'm going to divide them by the intent signals. So that way the messages become dynamic, because 2 companies on paper might have the right profile to take on Bootsuite, but they might have different intent signals right now. So one of them's hiring a new social media marketing manager, and the other one is launching a product in Asia. Different intent signals, different messaging. So think about that when you build your triggers based upon intent signals, that then means that you change your message market fit. So it's not just in the ICP. The ICP changes according to what's actually happening within that organization and what that company is doing. And this is where I see a lot of emails just fail, because you haven't segmented lists properly on that basis. Okay. And again, as you can hopefully tell, this isn't really about just the filters within lists. It's the thinking applied to the filters, because then it's very easy to put some filters in, but you've not appropriated copy and messaging to intent and triggers and signals. So that's just something to think about when it comes to building your list. And as we discussed, when it came to case studies, you can also reverse engineer. Tell me about your happiest active clients. When you look at that happiest active clients, you can have a look at what signals that they have that made them great clients. And you can use that to build an ICP as well. So you might say, look, who is your most ideal client that you currently have? Give me 3 of those companies. Do you have case studies attached to them? Let me have a quick look at those compared to the ICP that you're giving me. And you might say, you might realize, oh, who I'm going after is not a reflection of who I have. And I've missed these intent signals that are obvious because they did not come up. So I might say, great, I'm looking to sell Bootsuite to FMCG companies that ultimately, like Nestle and these, and they might say, well, I had a look at your best case studies of your best paying clients, and they have interesting signals that tell me that something different is happening. So that might be a discovery that you'll make with your current companies that are clients, and you can use that as a reflection to identify who you should go after. So we spoke about in one of the previous sessions about the concept of when you're doing email verification with DKIM, DMARC, SPF, look at what your client is actually doing and tell them how to improve their own one. But you should also not just look at their case studies. If you can get a list of their active clients, and you could, again, build that into the onboarding form. Give me, 3 of your best paying clients currently who match your ideal avatar, so I can have a look. So that would be, that would be great to look at. And then you can map that against their supposed ICP and then say, look, we compared who you want to go after versus who you have, and who you want to go after is very different from who you have. And therefore, we need to figure out what to do with this discrepancy, because that might then impact the emails that we send. So a lot of companies don't think about this because people think about their ideal customer, but we need to ask, who's your current customer? And is your current customer your ideal customer? And can you give me the examples of who your current customers are? Because we just want to have a look at them. And we notice these signals ultimately. So that's where it talks about lookalike positioning. So ultimately, it's well known and established in the paid media space that we want to build lookalike audiences. But the same thing still applies from ultimately lookalike businesses as well, based on current businesses that you seem to have attracted. Okay, so that's that part there. Now, public, I don't know why it says public exhaust, but public information is as strong a signal as ultimately database signals. So I think public signals, by the way, are better than database signals, because public signals are factual because they exist in the public domain, and database signals, we can never truly know true source of data. Okay, so if you have a list and you're able to ultimately figure out through scraping at scale some of these things that's listed here. So, look at do they have a job board section? And is the job board section been recently updated? Have they got any awards? What is happening? Where can I find other information about them? So running basically third-party enrichment of your list to then determine strongest signals is a really great way to put together cold email campaigns, because I think that they tend to be more accurate as to what's going on. Because, for example, a technographic signal such as, oh, I see you recently installed HubSpot. And you say, oh, it says that, but we just updated the pixel. We've had a HubSpot for 10 years. We're not looking to change. So we're not looking for a HubSpot consultant because we reinstalled HubSpot. However, if they've got, for example, webinars that are happening around sales because they're constantly giving webinars, then maybe the angle becomes different. So just looking at different signals that you can use. And one of the important things with this is, because this is a lot, but if you can improve your level of checks that you can make across different items, you then inform the quality of the cold emails that you write and the lists that you build, because you're looking at what is my signal set. So what you need to think about is, what automated signal checks can I do at scale that are very easy for me to do? First of all, how can I expand that out across the ecosystem of checks that I do, so that then can inform, I've got this huge ICP that in theory is correct, but it's static. Now, what can I do to make that ICP dynamic based upon active signals that are present on the market? Now, let that determine the email copy that I should build and who are the people within those companies, which is why you look at it at a company level. You don't look at it at an individual job title level, because you look at company signals. And then that determines, this is who I'm actually going after. and you're going to do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, because we've got this dynamic ICP that changes based on public signals that exist in the marketplace. So when people say, well, it's not working, what should we do to change? You say, well, we're going to have a look at the intent signals again and identify some new triggers. So we can just see that 10 companies recently hired. So we're just going to send them some manual cold emails, some very quick personalized cold emails, and we're going to see what result that we get based upon the fact that they've just recently hired, as an example. Okay. And there's other things here that give you some sense of that. So as we discussed a bit, company signals also can come from website derived qualification. So it ultimately is a way to say, we saw you were missing X, or we saw you were doing this. So if you're, for example, selling software services, why not send emails based around companies that have poor load speed, poor page speed? Because then they'll be open because you lead with value first. So if you build a list selling software development services, why don't you take your ICP and then run website checks across your entire ICP to find security issues that exist across those websites and what those security issues are? Much like Saurabh, who's in this group, you got an email about them being able to change our password, I think, on a tool that we built. And you directly, if you think about it, sent it to the founder of the company based on an email or a message you received. That's way more intelligent signaling. So if we're selling, for example, software development services, why don't we look for signals related to security problems or website problems, and then say, hey, we notice that your page speed or your LCP is an issue. We specialize in software development and helping you, with the software that we build, we resolve issues. If you're selling SEO services, why don't you look for sites that have no schema? If you're selling a CMS such as Salesforce, or selling a CMS that's a WordPress an alternative to WordPress, look at companies that have old CMSs and say, look, we can help you doing updates. So website derived qualification is really interesting when it comes to, if you're selling investment as an example, right? You're looking for companies that will invest. Why not look at businesses that have recently announced, this is a new company that we just invested in, or this is something new that we've done. So we can look, because people tend to, when they change something, they promote it on their website. So what we tend to look at, for example, is a LinkedIn filter for people, but you need to look at company level filters, because company decisions are superior to individual decisions. Is this making sense, everybody? That you look at what's happening at a company level, and that's why they talk about this concept of buying committees rather than individuals, because the company has more sway than the individual. So you look at the company signals, and then that's an easier way to penetrate the organization, because that then allows you to email multiple people within the organization, because it's a company problem, not an individual problem. So if someone approaches Pearl Lemon and says, hey, we know that you are looking to improve, you're looking for a new CMS because you've tried HubSpot, you failed with it, you're trying Google Sheets. They can contact some person in sales, they can contact someone in marketing, and they can contact me, because it's a company level problem. If they just approach, for example, Saurabh because they see he's a director of operations, he might say, well, I'm happy with the Google Sheet, it's fine. It's a company problem, it's not my problem. Or he understands it's a company problem. So these distinctions have become really important. So that's why website derived qualification is quite important. If you think about, well, how does this correlate with a signal that I could find on an ICP's website? So this is how you begin to whittle down. You start with your static ICP, but then you really narrow based upon signal, And that's how you say, look, we don't determine, you've given us 10 different possible ICPs, but we're not going to now just determine which ones are best based upon who you think will buy the quickest. We're only going to look at triggers and intent signals, and that's going to tell us who to go after. And then we're going to build copy based upon that. And that's the way to kind of think about it. Okay. So that's when you build the persona paths, not just contact paths, contact dump. So here's our first choice, here's our second choice, here's our backup, and here's the founder, basically. So rotating intelligently across the company is when you want to target multiple people, and what is the strategy around who you target. And it needs to be just some thinking around that, because the new rule, for those of you, because I know this is for the team, the new rule could be, right, we get broad ICPs, then we use trigger signals. Now we've got the triggers. Now we look at 3 people per organization. So we're sending the same level of email contacts, but we're now expanding. So much like we do, and we'll come to it, much like we're using 3 LinkedIn accounts, we now do 3 email contacts per organization. And we have different messaging going out to those 3 contacts to see which job title gets the most return based upon signals that are apparent within the market. And then we build messaging based upon role mapped to their responsibilities, but we always target a couple. So that's where you talk about persona paths and not just contact dumps. Being like, right, we're just going to target heads of marketing at XYZ company. You're like, but that's not the way to do it. Because the heads of marketing might be the person who makes the ultimate decision, but they don't do any of the research. They don't do the research. So they're not the ones who are going to really actually look at your email. They might, best case, they forward it on, but mostly they just ignore it. They'll be like, this is Harsh's responsibility. Harsh is going to do the research and then come to me. So therefore, even if I'm the chief marketing officer, or Saurabh, I'm the operations director, I ignore all of these emails. Because the way that I operate is that Harsh comes to me, and then I look at Harsh's shortlist. So you need to think about who's the first choice role, and who's the second choice role, and then who's the backup. And that's why I talk about the power of 3. Go for 3 people, give them slightly different messaging, and that way we build density to penetrate an organization. So we look for depth rather than breadth. Breadth gives you ICP statically. Dynamic ICP gives you triggers to the narrowing of the companies, and then you go for depth once you've done the narrowing. So that's that part there. And then, of course, you can think about ultimately international list building. It needs regional logic because a lot of people ultimately use US style data. But what happens ultimately is that job titles and job responsibilities and insights change based upon regions. So it may be the case that ultimately the VP of marketing means a completely different thing in Germany versus France versus the UK. It's just things worth investigating and worth checking. And most of the data that we derive is from US data sets. And you just need to think about adaptation fundamentally. So adaptation, and then also there's a consideration about, do we, if you're thinking about list building, are we sourcing from providers that specialize in a region? So if we're using, for example, if you're using Apollo and Zoom, they're US centric. Where are the European equivalents? You're going to get better data. So if we're data scraping, why aren't we scraping from companies that have regional strength and expanding the sources that we pull from? Because we can get much better data sources if we know that a company has most of its strength in Europe. So as you build your sources, get sources that have strengths in different regions to get much better lists. Because otherwise what happens is that you get lists, but they're outdated, right? We don't know they're outdated because they're not building data that's just as relevant for a particular region. So what will sometimes happen is that people will build a German list from Zoom Info. Actually, you need a Euro, and that will be an old list, but we won't know it's an old list because technically the data is still valid, but the intent signals aren't up to date. People have moved on and there's problems, or it's just not a great list. Whereas if you build a European first, get a European first provider, you're able to get better quality of data. So that's part there. Okay. Compliance should shape the list, not just so this is the GDPR type of stuff basically. So just make sure that you when you build lists that they're compliant. Not really much to add there. And then your list, straightforward, just make sure that they're up to date, they're validated. So that's that part there. And then just list scoring. So talk about the idea of lead scoring. You want to do list scoring as well, basically. So when you do your strategic part of it, you then are able to score, because what will happen is that you might say that, I can't message everybody with personalized email campaigns because there's a lot of work to do. Great. So let's build a scoring matrix and then determine who's the most logical to go after first of all, and see what result that we can get. And this is where you get into the world of great. At Pearl Lemon, we see it. We're able to book podcasts for me consistently. Every week I'm on 3 or 4 podcasts a week, right? Podcasts are easier, but what the process is important because we do manual research. We look at people that are active currently and we send them personalized email based upon things that they have written. So how do we apply that at scale to companies when we're selling services or we're prospecting? It's about building relevancy, looking at building smaller contact data, and then focusing upon who you think is going to be the best. So what can happen is that you get a big static ICP of 5,000, 10,000 contacts. You then build your intent and hiring triggers. And then you look at that and you say, great, this is going to be month 1. This is going to be month 2. This is going to be month 3. And we're going to look at these guys month 1, these guys month 2, and these guys month 3. And that's our plan for the next 3 months. Obviously, where an ICP works, we continue with that ICP. But we work on the basis that we're going to continue rotating. If you do that thinking up front, it's going to save you down the line to say, this is strategy 1. this is strategy 2, and this is our fallback strategy, because we've got a lot of intent signals. But to make sure that we can target people, we need to target people with quality. We need to do it sequentially. So that's kind of a good way to think about it. And as it says here, it's the whole principle, small batch before big batch. So that's where 50 to 200 contacts, looking at those contacts, seeing what kind of result we get based on personalized intent signals, and then looking at it that way. And then, of course, you can have a look at copy performance versus source performance. So that's an interesting one, that if you compare Apollo versus Zoom Info versus another provider, which actual providers tend to give the best replies? Which countries have great deliverability versus best deliverability? So, one of the things that's not even sometimes thought about is that, are there sources that tend to get better results? So you're like, you know what, we've got 10 different triggers, but the trigger that actually matters is if someone's hiring. All of the other triggers are great, but we prioritize current hiring ahead of the different triggers, because that's a trigger that signals real intent to spend. So looking at triggers like that and ranking triggers and list sources becomes really important as you look at them all and say, these are all of the possible intent signals. Which of the intent signals are the likeliest to mean that someone's going to spend money, if and where we have that available, and what should we do with that in mind? So that's that part there. So this is the up-to-date section, that when you build a list, you need to think about, bounced domains, do not contact accounts, former customers, competitors, previous negative replies, bad fit industries, over contacted accounts, and recently touched leads. And this is list ultimately cleansing and list sanity. So if you're running a campaign, make sure you're aware of competitors, make sure you're aware of clients, make sure you're aware of potential former customers, because we don't think about, when you're doing outreach campaigns, if you're running an agency, are you also asking, well, what about your former clients? Should we email them as well? Or are there people that you've already got no's from that you contacted before in the past? So when you give us your do not contact list, give us current customers. Do you want us to give us former customers? And have you got any negative do not contact list from people that you've researched before that said no? Was that given to you by your current agency or your current company? Because what will often happen in the agency space, we use 3 companies, we've got crappy results, but who's already said to you, no, we're not interested? Because there's no value in us emailing that same person again. So what you actually need is the contact list from previous campaigns to make sure that can inform who you're going to be targeting moving forward. Because otherwise, unknowingly, we could be targeting the same person who thinks, you know what, Harsh, you already bloody emailed me. I've already heard from your company. So why are you emailing me again? And Harsh thinks, I've got no knowledge of that. I didn't know they were not on the do not contact list. So we need to really think about some of these things as well, because they can impact campaigns, right? So that's just something to consider when it comes from ultimately building proper list suppression, because do not contact is way more than simply current customers. It's former customers, and it's anyone you've already emailed who said no. And that's actually quite a big list. Or anyone who emailed and maybe didn't reply, because maybe the messaging needs to be different, or someone who emailed and said, contact me again in 6 months. We just need to understand who you've been in contact with within the last 6 months to understand what we need to do. So there's that, okay? And then there's AI that can, of course, help to build lists, but it's worth saying that it's the human thinking first, because GPT, Claude, the agents, the AI still does not think at this level. The level that we're describing right now, it does not think at this level. It's still prompt based, and even the agentic, it's all still human instruction. It will figure out what it thinks to be the best, but it still doesn't have a way of putting together all of these connected strands. So it's important to say that agentic or semi-automated research is useful, but it's only after you properly define segmentation, that you properly thought about all of these elements, and then as a consequence, you're able to think, right now, I can tell the AI what is it that I need to do, because I built this operating framework and I've understood the static signals, how that becomes dynamic, what are the intent triggers. There's firmographic, there's technographic, there's website derived, and there's third-party signals. Which ones are relevant now? Let me look at how to prioritize those signals. And then based upon those signals, I'm going to go three contacts deep within an organization. These contacts need individual messaging. Have I got the relevant case studies that relate to that? And now, can I build a really, really good list of 300 people at 100 companies that I can send really personalized emails? And then it gives you all kinds of opportunity, because then you can even say, you know what, let's just use your primary domain, because we're not going to send more than 200 emails a month. So let's make sure we get deliverability, but we're going to write really good damn emails, and they're all going to be personalized. And we want to run a test, Mr. Client, where you give us one domain that's your company, and we're going to do the cold email stuff. And then you can compare results and say your domain's doing really, really well. But that only happens after you're able to do a sufficient level of filtering to get really, really powerful lists. And then say, look, as part of our campaigns, we do cold email, but we also want to run one campaign from your account, and that campaign is going to have no more than a maximum of 50 emails a week. So it's 250 emails a month, and 250 divide, let's just say 3 is, I don't know, let's just say 80. It's 82. So that's 82 companies that we're going to email, and our goal is to get 10 bookings. So do you see how it begins to allow you, once you've done proper segmentation, to do things that you ordinarily might not even consider? Because a lot of people talk about, oh, don't send cold email. But the reality is that everyone sends cold email from an email when you email someone that you don't know. But people reply because there's a relevancy behind what you sent. So then that allows you to, use different kind of targeting. So they are my thoughts on cold email list building. And as we've discussed, cold email infrastructure, then we've discussed the building of your ICP, and now we're talking about cold email list building. You'll see that all of this thinking, I suspect, won't change, because this thinking was true 10 years ago, and this thinking is still true now. That, well, there needs to be a reason to message someone at the right time. And are you messaging the right person at the right time with the right message? That is something that's true in sales, true in communication, true in your personal life. If I come home and I know my wife's had a really long day at work, it's the wrong time to ask her to then cook for me, because she's come home from a long day and she's had a frustrating day with clients. So should I ask her now? This stuff will never change fundamentally, and something that's really important to talk about was because of a cold email list building. So I'll now take people's main kind of takeaways or things that they thought that was new. I didn't consider that. So let's go around the room for whoever wants to kind of put their hand up and say, oh, that was interesting. I think that, I didn't necessarily know that or consider that. Yeah, go ahead. Saurabh. Yeah, go ahead, Saurabh.
Yeah, for me, it would be the static ICP versus the dynamic ICP. So looking at the intent signals and the various other things that we discussed, that's quite important, and that's what we've been doing recently for many client campaigns, where the clients provide us more so the static ICPs. And the other part is, where is enough attention being given to where are we going to even start? Once we've defined the ICPs, am I going to start with the accounts, or am I going to start with the leads filter? That is the people's filter in layman's terms. So like you said, defining the companies first and then picking, say, 3 people per company, or wherever those pain points or triggers would be more relevant, is one thing. And then comes the final stage of, so from static ICP, we define the dynamic ICP. We pick all the triggers, which are the most prominent and important triggers. Based on that, we prioritize our list or the ICP. So wherein you spoke of, we're going to score those leads or those ICPs or those lists. And then the final stage of, so that company, 3 people from each company, the messaging would be different from all those 3 people, because they have their different, it is different how they relate to that particular pain point, depending on the department they are from. So yeah, this is, I think, the way that you have discussed the ICP is not leaving any part to it. It is right from the initial strategic thinking to the execution, like how to break an ICP into buckets, and then doing the personalized messaging thereafter. So identify the company, the people might change, but the company's requirements, needs, situation would remain static. So go after identify the right accounts, and then pick the right people to go after those companies. So yeah. Pretty, I would say, interesting.
Really good feedback there, Saurabh. I think there's a lot of consideration if we apply that depth. If anyone applies that depth of thinking, I think that certainly there's more chances to succeed. So Harsh, I saw you nodding your head a lot. What are you thinking, Harsh?
Usually we used to make some static ICPs and just ran the campaigns just through it. A person might look very perfect on paper according to static ICP, but if they don't really need the service, they wouldn't really be the lead for us, right? So we can just quickly just put some couple of filters on top of Polo, like their hiring intent and everything. Let's say we are running a campaign for lead generation. We are reaching out to marketing people, right? And we just put a filter there. Like if they're hiring for, let's say, lead gen executive or lead gen head, that means the company is already investing in that field, right? So that would be the very best targeting for us. And other than that, of course, personalization of the message. What we are doing recently for some campaigns are the industries are quite similar among a couple of ICPs for the same client, and we just made some changes with the job titles here and there, and we just made different copies for them, and we just locked them. So yeah, these couple of things
Yeah.
would be
Good, perfect. Thank you, Harsh. That was really good. I think that, as you said, with the intent signals being important, I know that you guys are already beginning to implement that, and this is probably just a continuation of that. So great. Let's go with one more person. Shambhavi, I can see your mind ticking. What's on your mind, Shambhavi?
I think I'll add to what Harsh has said, that inclusion and exclusion point which you have mentioned, that not only the inclusion where the actions like we are hiring for this third party, and excluding is what we actually don't want. So this is an important point. I think that will turn around the ICP altogether, especially when you mentioned that whatever is written on the paper cannot always act as the implementation point on making a list. So I think that is also an important point to make.
Nothing much to add from my side. I think we've covered most of it, and yeah, no, nothing much to add.